soil.
The recent price spike could mean more farmers going organic for the long term.
Everyone, a minute to go until the start of cash equity trading. I'm Francine Lacqua in London with Tom McKenzie.
And here are your top stories. Johnson defiant. The Prime Minister clings to power as the avalanche of resignations continues. We are live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive, Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation. Plus, path to parity, the euro is deemed unbuyable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession. Samsung sales boost sentiment in stocks.
Now, let's take a look at the futures, Tom. A lot of the focus, of course, is on the drama here in the UK. I have to say, it's even more drama than a Spanish telenovela. The focus, of course, is on what the Prime Minister does for the moment. He's clinging strong. A lot of the pound is, of course, focused, or at least pricing in that the Prime Minister cannot stay on for long. But the one thing we need to watch out for is that it still probably has further to go downwards because of inflation and growth prospects.
Yeah, more than 40 resignations, ministers and aides and ex-officials coming out and saying it's not a question of if, but when Boris Johnson is finally forced out as Prime Minister. And in terms of UK assets, not a lot of movement, not a lot of sensitivity to the political rockets that we're seeing play out in Westminster. We'll be, of course, in Downing Street Live, as we said, for the latest on that story. In terms of the open then, we're seeing the Spanish IBEX gaining more than 1%. You're seeing the FTSE 100 up 0.9%. You have the optimism around the earnings picture from Samsung. We'll be doing a deep dive into the semiconductor space. But also, of course, we got the FOMC minute suggesting, as we said in the headlines, that the restrictive policy, further restrictive policy could be in the cards if inflation and prices remain elevated. A determination then from the Fed to get back down to that 2% target. On the oil front as well, and we'll look at that shortly, $100 WTI, the last time I looked, at about $98 per barrel. The French CAC going up 1.2%, and again, the gains here in the UK up 69 points. Let's move it on and see how things are playing out cross asset then. After the gains of between 0.3% and 0.6% on Wall Street yesterday, the futures looking to build on that optimism, modest optimism, up 0.3%. The US 2-year currently at 2.97. Euro dollar remaining, of course, in focus for us, 1.01 currently in euro dollar, and the options suggesting there's a 50% chance now, probability of getting to parity within the next month. Currently, gains of 0.1% for the single currency after the losses we've seen in the last few days. $98 a barrel on WTI. Continue to watch that as well. Down 0.3%, of course, on those recession concerns, growth concerns, and of course, what is happening in China. Francine.
Yeah, if you look at the industry groups or the sectors that are moving the most, we still have energy on the upside, basic resources, banks all gaining between 1.7 and 2%. So the focus firmly on some of that inflation data. We have also the ECB minutes a little bit later. And I think the main part in that is whether they talk about fragmentation. We could see a move on some of the sectors that, of course, are more exposed to periphery Europe. And then the other question is if markets are right about a 50 basis point hike from the ECB in September, what does that mean for some of the banks and some of course, the sectors that are much, much, much more in tune with what the ECB does?
Okay, back to the centrality of politics here in the UK now. Desperate and deluded. That is the front page of this morning's Guardian newspaper as Boris Johnson faces an unprecedented revolt, and it keeps coming, within his government. Dozens of Conservative MPs have resigned from their roles, demanding he step down. The Prime Minister even sacked former ally Michael Gove from cabinet. But Johnson remains defiant and has signalled he will continue to fight for his political life.
You're asking about something that is not going to happen. History teaches us that the best way to have a period of stability and government and not to have early elections is to allow people with mandates to get on.
For more, we are joined from Downing Street by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, I'm going to steal one of your favourite phases on this story. The grease piglet slipping out of the grasp and the grip of his own parliamentary party, many within his own cabinet as well. What is next? What is the latest and what is next for Boris Johnson?
Well, Tom, the resignations keep on coming. We've now passed the 50 mark. This morning, you've lost the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis and the Treasury Minister Helen Whately, and it's almost a third of the government gone now. This is unprecedented in British history, which has consequences not just for Boris Johnson, but for the government's legislative agenda. MPs were complaining last night that sessions to discuss legislation were being cancelled because the government just can't get the staff. Tory MPs are saying that they're turning down jobs, including the former Brexit Secretary David Davis. And it means the administration is paralysed. But Boris Johnson is fighting on, or trying to, which he signalled by sacking Michael Gove last night, seen as one of the most competent members of the government, so it's dangerous to have him on the back benches. Johnson could also try to get back on the front foot by announcing a new economic policy or a mini budget next week alongside Nadhim Zahawi, his new Chancellor.
So, Lizzie, good morning. Does he go this week or next week?
It seems so unlike Boris Johnson to resign. If he were to do it this week, it seems more likely to be next week. Put it that way, Francine, because the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers is having a meeting next week at which it's likely to re-elect its leadership with people who are in favour of changing the rules, shortening that grace period on the confidence vote, having another one which Johnson will lose. But that doesn't mean that Johnson has to go. Then it would go to a vote of no confidence in Parliament. And it's really a question of how far Johnson wants to push the Constitution. If he tries to call a general election, and betting markets are saying there's a 90% chance of him doing that in 2022, the Queen could turn down that request on the grounds that he's lost the confidence of his party. But in a climate like this, where a snap election could happen, I spoke to macro strategist Viraj Patel at Vanda Research. He says, don't touch the pound.
Touch the pound because it probably has further to go. Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden there for us in front of number 10 Downing Street. Now let's get over also to our Bloomberg MLive managing editor, Mark Cudmore. Mark, I know we're all obsessed with UK politics, but there's quite a lot going on with inflation and, of course, the US.
Yeah, absolutely, Francine. Good morning. The Fed minutes yesterday made clear that the Fed is much more focused on inflation than recession risk for now, and they're absolutely right to be so. And the data yesterday really made that point. There was the ISM PMI data that was strong, and we kind of took some, positivity from that. But there was another bit of data that was very important, JOLTS, and this is a really important part of the story. Job openings in the US. 14 months ago, I was worried that this was at a record level, and that would be a big inflation problem. Well, that seems outdated. I thought it was at a record at 8.1 million. It has just fallen in the latest print to 11.25 million, i.e. we could lose another 3 million job openings in the next couple of months, and we'd only get back to a level that was record unseen before May last year, or before March last year, apologies. And that shows just how hot the jobs market is in the US. Now, the situation in the US is deteriorating very rapidly on an economic front, but it's deteriorating from a very, very strong point. The consumer household balance sheets are exceptionally strong. The labour market is hot. That's why the US recession will come a little bit later than people think. It will come just a little bit later than people think, and inflation will prove stickier. And that's why the Fed is going to have to hike rates more than it's priced right now, and that's why yields will go higher than people think later on this year.
Okay, Bloomberg MLive managing editor Mark Cudmore then on the outlook for yields. Let's bring in at this point for more on this story and the rest of the main themes rippling across these markets, Lynn Thomason and Tatiana Pouhan, Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Tobin. Let's start with you, Lynn, here in the studio. On that line then from Mark Cudmore, markets now pricing at about 75 basis points from the Fed in July. Do we need to start reassessing? Do markets need to start reassessing just how hard and how fast this Fed is going to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in my mind, the narrative that you're seeing between markets is it going to be inflation or is it going to be recession? And depending on which way the news is coming in the day, depends on which moves that you see. So like yesterday, we saw, the Fed coming, again, reiterating that's going to be really hard on inflation. And you're seeing, bonds sell off. And I think, when it's recession, bonds really rally.
I mean, I don't know how we started inflation because we're all obsessed with UK, right? Tatiana, when you look at exactly what could be priced in pound, I know there's concern about inflation. I know there's concern about growth. Does it matter if there's this like political battle with, Boris Johnson hanging on and not wanting to go for sterling?
Yes, obviously, I mean, for the sterling, it will have a direct impact. And, the more this is going to go on, the more this is going to do harm. But this is something which is just like on the very short term. I think like medium to long run, what matters really more is, inflation, is recession. And I think one thing that is completely underestimated is actually a scenario where we have both at the same time, recession and inflation, and where potentially, central banks will actually feel obliged to keep rates up and not, make rates go down again, especially the Fed, who probably takes its mandate of keeping inflation low much more seriously, even if this means that, the Fed actually risks to, trigger a recession that is worse than it would have been otherwise.
Lynn, is there a vulnerability in UK assets to the politics? We haven't seen it yet. Sterling is up about 0.2 in the session today, 0.3% as things stand, 119. But really, as Tatiana was saying, it's more about the economics, it's more about inflation, it's more about the trajectory of the BOE that's affecting the pound.
Yeah, those are absolutely the big drivers of the pound right now. I think, the interesting part is that it's really hard to find anyone that's bullish on the pound right now. Everyone's saying that the move is headed lower, partly because the dollar has been so strong, because of this risk-off sentiment in the markets. Everyone's looking for safety, and that's certainly not in the pound.
Yeah, so Tatiana, where do you see safety?
Well, it's not so easy. I think, there are some fund managers who actually hold a lot of cash because they feel this is even better than, what, all the other alternatives that you could be exposed to. Then I clearly think also, you should think about hedging strategies, so like systematic overlay strategies that help you to sort of reduce the downside risk of your risky asset exposure. So this could help as well. And I think in the end of the day, it sounds maybe very boring, but diversification is probably also an important element of safety, in markets with very high uncertainty where it's super hard to predict, what's next going to happen.
On the question of oil, Tatiana, you currently see WTI $98 a barrel. We had a Bloomberg report pointing to traders freaking out that the price is dropping. This is good news, surely. Lower oil prices, this is good news for inflation. Why are we not celebrating this?
Well, I guess we are not celebrating this because this indicates, that there's some sort of recession risk priced in. And so, it's for let's say, a bad reason, that the oil price is going down. But I would also not overinterpret this because, again, I think energy and sort of access to sort of energy is going to be a key factor going forward. And so on the medium to longer run, I think, the fact that now oil prices decline a little bit, it's just a very short-term phenomenon, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to that.
Lynn, I feel like every day there's bad news. We were pricing in bad news. Is there any glimmer of hope out there? Is there something that actually looks a little bit stronger, maybe a data point, maybe the way the markets work that we could bring in?
Probably earnings season in the next few weeks, right? I mean, the big question, I think, for investors, will corporate profits hold up in this environment? Will companies be able to pass on these increases? Will it be manageable? Or will you have companies saying, we're being squeezed on both sides with inflation, lower demand, and, it's really biting into corporate profits? I think if you see that, it's going to be in trouble, but maybe you don't, and that's the bright spot.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I can't believe it's earnings season already. I feel like it was 2 minutes ago.
Samsung coming out with results that are pretty decent, suggesting that maybe, at least in that space, there's a little optimism.
Lynn Thomason, thank you. Tatiana Puhan, Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Tobam, stays with us. Now, coming up, as Tom was saying, Samsung reports better than expected earnings, banishing investors' worst fears about the $550 billion chip industry. We break down the numbers next, and this is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. We are 15 minutes into the European trading day. This is a picture for European stocks gaining some 0.8%. We heard, of course, from the Fed yesterday, which led to quite a big move in Treasury. The focus firmly on inflation, even if it means slowing down growth. And then we look at, of course, the ECB minutes a little bit later on, Tom.
Okay, let's check in on some of the individual corporates. I'm not going to delve too deeply into the semiconductor space, but we did want to just highlight what's happening with ST Micro. Laura Wright is going to break down what happened with Samsung earnings, because that's being reflected, of course, across the semiconductor space. You're seeing gains there of 2.5% for ST Micro. Telecom Italia, this company, the board has agreed to allow the CEO to spin off parts of this business to extract value. You're seeing gains of 1.6%. And EDF, not a huge surprise, but we have the details now that the government over in France will nationalize this company, going from 84% stake to 100% stake, losses of 0.9%. Right, talking of the semiconductor space then, a 21% jump in revenue for Samsung, the better than expected results from South Korea's largest company, sparking a rally for the $550 billion chip-making sector. Bloomberg's Laura Wright is across the results of South Korea's largest company. Laura, what were the key takeaways then from these earnings?
Relief for investors and analysts, Tom. It's why Samsung closed up 3.2%. Sales boosted by this narrative that weakening demand from consumers was somewhat overplayed. Sales also benefiting from currency depreciation. In fact, the won down by 9% against the US dollar year to date, benefiting exports, of course, while operating profit was a slight miss. That is perhaps a sign that higher raw materials costs are starting to bite. The chip sector is facing a number of headwinds, and my chart shows how South Korean semiconductor stockpiles increased by more than 50% year over year for the month of May. That is their highest level in almost 4 years. Consumers really paring back expensive technology product spending, and add into the mix that aggressive tightening from central banks. These chip names are really under pressure.
What does that mean for the sector as a whole, Laura?
Well, one hedge fund in the region, Billionfold Asset Management, they've actually been buying up shares of Samsung over the last week. They think that it offers an attractive entry point. Samsung has fallen by almost 40% since its all-time high in early 2021. As you mentioned, there was a chipmaker rally in the Asian session. We are starting to see a read across here in Europe, especially with names such as ASML, ASM, Infineon, and ST Micro green across the screen.
Thank you so much, Laura, right there with the very latest on, of course, the tech sector. Let's bring in back Tatiana Puhan, Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Tobam, to drill on the markets. We're going to drill you on tech stocks, Tatiana. What do you do with them? Do you see any value in any parts of that sector?
But I think actually this sector is still overvalued. So what you could see now in the beginning of the year is that in the more growthy part of the sector, you could see certain corrections. But, you know, when it comes to the really large stocks, There's still a very long way to go. We still see that there's a lot of future earnings and excess earnings growth actually priced into these valuations. And the big valuation gap that these stocks still have compared to the rest of the market is only justifiable if these companies are able to keep up with this excess growth. And what I think what markets completely underestimate is the longer-term consequences on consumer demand of the inflation that we see now, on the rate hikes that we see now, and of a deterioration in economic growth. And that is something that will have to be priced in. That is something that will also have an impact eventually on earnings of these companies, and then we will actually see a very, very big mean reversion.
Tatiana, I know you've written about this and you thought deeply about the fragility around the consumer, of course, as we lead into that earnings season. So beyond technology, what is vulnerable to further downgrades, as the consensus seems to be that these earnings forecasts are just too high at this point?
So I think for me, that really the major risk concentration in the market that we have at the moment is technology. But obviously, there are also a few other sectors, that especially over the last, I would say, 12 months, have been excessively pushed, by investors. So for instance, energy is such an example. So the big question will be, whether this is like a one-off or whether, this is actually going to continue. So are energy prices going to rise, when the economy slows down? Or is this then also something, that is going to trigger a mean reversion on energy stocks? Also, if we think about, longer term, climate transition and so on and so forth, what is the impact going to be on certain energy names that are not able to actually, participate and sort of be part of this climate and energy transition? So for those, there should be like a mean reversion to come, but this is certainly more on the longer end.
Tatiana, do you do anything with Chinese stocks or parts of the market that are very exposed to China as we await the GDP numbers?
Yes, so we are also, we are really having a very big exposure to emerging markets and hence also to China. But we're not really taking bets, So at the moment, there are actually a lot of people saying, so yeah, China is a good opportunity. It's a good sort of, place to search for yield and so on. I personally don't share this point of view, at least on the mid to longer term perspective, because for me, China remains a very big geopolitical risk. And this is something that I would personally prefer to stay away from.
Okay, and Tatiana, on geopolitical risks, of course, we can't turn our gaze away from what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, and gas. July the 11th is when that Nord Stream pipeline gets shut down for maintenance. Are we underpricing the risks? Are the market's underpricing the risks that additional, that final 40% of gas will finally be cut off from Russia to Europe?
Yes, I think, markets underestimate the risk because they underestimate, what is going to be the impact on, productive activities of companies. Because also, obviously, politicians, they still try to, they try to tell us, okay, everything will be all right, we will manage somehow, we have emergency plans. But I think, once the moment is really there, we risk to actually realize that it's much, much worse than we have expected or anticipated. And potentially it's also very hard, to anticipate all the consequences right now. So there's definitely more volatility to be expected from that and probably also downside potential.
Okay, Tatiana Pouhan, Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Tobin, thank you. On the underpriced risks around additional gas cuts from Russia to Europe and all things across the market themes driving asset pricing this morning. Coming up, defiant Boris Johnson desperately clings to power after an avalanche of resignations that keep coming, by the way, from the UK government. We will bring you the very latest from Westminster. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 24 minutes into the European trading day. It's risk on. You're seeing gains of over 1% across the benchmark. Future stateside, the S&P E-minis and the Nasdaq futures pointing to gains of 0.3% building on the upside that we saw yesterday. Across your sectors, led by energy, autos and basic resources. Just one sector in the green, in the red, I should say, food and beverage. That has just ticked over into the green, just very modest gains. But every single sector now across the European space pointing up. Let's get to the Bloomberg First Word News now with Laura Wright. Laura.
Thanks, Tom. The US and its allies are said to be discussing capping the price of Russian oil between $40 and about $60 a barrel, while attempting to minimize the impact on their own economies. Sources say a more specific threshold would depend on market conditions when a cap is agreed. The US also weighing enforcement tools, including secondary sanctions, as a measure of last resort. Shanghai has reported its highest number of COVID infections since late May. The doubling in cases to 54 is raising concerns of another lockdown in China's financial hub. Meanwhile, Beijing reported 4 new cases. The capital is set to roll out China's first ever vaccine mandate next week, limiting entry to a raft of entertainment venues to inoculated people. France will nationalize its nuclear giant EDF. The plan would help the struggling utility ride out Europe's worst energy crisis in a generation and invest in new atomic plants. Prime Minister Elizabeth Bourne said the state will raise its stake in EDF to 100% from 84% currently. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire says the government aims to have new management in place from September. British Airways is said to be nearing a deal with one of the unions representing check-in employees. The agreement would avoid using industrial action during the peak travel season after the airline was forced to scrap nearly 30,000 flights since April due to a staff crunch. A person familiar with the matter said talks with the Unite union have progressed and an agreement is close. BA had earlier refused to cancel a 10% pay cut. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Francine.
Laura, thanks so much. Now we'll have plenty, of course, on the markets. We'll have a good look at what the UK does next, what the Prime Minister does next, and we'll also talk themes and thematics with Evie Hambro of BlackRock. This is Bloomberg.
We know that it's highly transmissible. We know that 2 doses of vaccines, Pfizer vaccine specifically, neutralize the virus, but not as efficiently, because various studies showing that reduction up to 40-fold, meaning that a 3rd dose is a must for it to successfully neutralize the variant. What we don't know is still that what are the effects of mix and matching between vaccines, and what are the capabilities of antibodies produced from this mix and matching in neutralizing Omicron. Because as we know, many parts of the world use different types of vaccines. And that would be a great data to look at. It will be also great to look at, because majority of the studies done uses a small sample number, and most of the time when you translate it to real world, the data changes. So it will be really good to look at large-scale data of the ability of antibodies from vaccines to neutralize this variant. Grateful here today that the virus, Omicron variant, still uses ACE2 receptor as its main entry. It means that all of the vaccines which are designed with spike in mind still works. Imagine if it uses a different receptor other than ACE2. None of the vaccines would work today. So I think that is the best news that we got from all these studies which came recently, the past couple of days.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. Johnson, defiant. The Prime Minister clings to power as an avalanche of resignations continue. We're live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive will Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation plus path to parity. The euro is deemed unbuyable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession, while Samsung sales also boost sentiment in stocks. Tom, if you look at stocks, I mean, it's unbelievable. They're kind of forgetting about growth and inflation, and they're focusing on a tech rally in Asia and saying, let's buy on that.
Yeah, temporarily at least. Let's see how long that lasts. Really brushing off what we saw from the FOMC in the minutes there around that more restrictive policy. The market's still pricing in about 75 basis points, of course, when it comes to the next hike in July. But you're seeing gains across European equities of more than 1%, building on the modest gains that we saw yesterday out of Wall Street and Europe as well, of course. Across the sectors, some of the leading sectors, including energy and basic resources. We continue to focus, of course, on the FX space, euro, dollar, and the options markets, implying a 50% probability of getting down to parity on euro dollar within the next month. Let's switch it over, see how things are playing out across these sectors then. The energy complex as well, with oil up this morning, but of course you've still got WTI currently down, what, $98 a barrel or so, 98.85, Brent at 101, just up 0.4%. So across your sectors, leading is energy up 2.8%, followed by autos and basic resources. Every single sector here in Europe is in the green, even food, beverage and travel, just notching out modest gains of between 0.2 and 0.3%. Bonds currently being sold off across the European space. Yields are up. You're seeing them most pronounced on the German 10-year, the Italian 10-year as well, those BTPs, 320, a gain there in the yield of 5 basis points. Fran?
We're obsessed with the UK story. First of all, I called it completely wrong yesterday because I thought he'd hang on to the summer. And then I have the most important tweet today, probably of the week, from Larry the Cat, clarifying on Twitter that, first of all, he is not Boris Johnson's cat, so he's not expecting to go anywhere. And he says, I mean, it's quite funny tweet saying, look, don't worry about me, focus on what's happening in the cabinet.
Great concern
News
about Larry the
use.
Cat, of course.
Of course, he's
the
like
resignations keep coming thick and fast. We're at 50 now. We're getting an update, of course, from Lizzie Burden, who's on the ground in Downing Street. More than 50 resignations from ministers and aides. So the pressure is there. It seems to be, the consensus seems to be not if he will go, but when he will go from Westminster.
Larry the Cat has not resigned yet. We can bring you that exclusive. Now, could this be the moment for equity investors to look past the short-term gloom and focus on longer-term trends? Well, our next guest says he's interested in 3 key thematic areas: technology, inflation, and the energy transition. Well, we're now joined by Evie Hambro, Global Head of Thematic and Sector Investing at BlackRock. He also demanded we talk about Larry the Cat, so we'll get to that in a second. Evie, thanks so much for joining us. Look, if you look at the themes, and these are longer, more protracted kind of changes in the economy that we'll see, but will they be upended by some of the short-term volatility?
Well, it's been a very difficult last few months for many of these areas, and I think the last few years has been a pretty consistent source of returns from these themes. At the end of the day, thematic investing is about backing the growth companies, and we're seeing an enormous derating of companies that were delivering that growth, a combination of inflation, interest rates, and uncertainties around recession. But when you look at the underlying businesses, these are very long-term trends that are going to support consistent growth through cycles. So you look at something like the energy transition. We all know that we have to move to a lower carbon-intense global economy. There isn't a choice around that. Governments have to make that decision. Society wants it, regulation wants it, businesses are moving in that direction. It's going to completely transform the commodity intensity of the global economy. You think about a wind turbine array, it's 100 times more commodity intensive than a gas turbine for a thermal power plant or something.
Evie, where are we then in the derating of these growth sectors? I'm just thinking about the window. If you're an investor with cash on the sidelines, you want to get exposure, what, in terms of timing and in terms of looking at the derating, when to get that exposure?
Well, I mean, there's lots of very famous people who are much better investors than me that say things like, you've got to be greedy when other people are fearful. And, we have seen a very sharp sell-off in a lot of sectors. A lot of companies are a lot lower now than they were, only a few months ago. And I think when you're looking at these businesses, sticking with quality is a great thing to do. There are great quality thematic names that we have across our portfolios that are going to deliver the growth that we're trying to capture for our clients. So that's where I would focus right now.
Are we finally realizing, I mean, first it's very counterintuitive, right, to have the president of the U.S. showing up to Saudi Arabia asking for more oil whilst we're talking about, transitioning and become greener. So will it take longer? Is it going to take a different path and then we're back on track? Because there's so many subtleties. And one of the other things we keep on hearing is that actually we just don't have enough of the commodities used for the energy transition, which is why it has been slower than maybe some thought.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's been slower because of supply. I think what we've seen is the need to do this at scale and at pace is essential. The things that are holding up aren't necessarily supply. It's more about regulation. It's getting the permission to go and build things. I mean, you don't want a wind farm next door to your house. The regulations, the planning and so on are slowing these things down. Commodity supply is definitely constrained. There's no doubt about that, across all of the mixture of things we need. And you're completely right. When we think about the scale of increase in supply that's needed between now and the end of this decade, it's enormous. The speed to develop these assets is very, very long now. We've got to take into consideration huge amounts of things, whether it's the permitting process, the issues we're having around existing supply at resource assets in some parts of the world where communities are blocking the road for supply. But,
Evie, just to follow up on Francine's point, has the urgency around national security and ensuring that you have the energy supplies that you need, remarkable to see Green Party officials within the German government calling for the refiring of coal-fired power stations. It's remarkable. To what extent is that damaging this transition that we were hoping to see before this conflict took place?
The conflict has definitely made everybody wake up that we need to do this faster than we probably previously thought. But we've also got to balance that against a just transition. We cannot have the volatility in the prices of some of these commodities, the volatility in power prices, the very high levels that we're now seeing across Europe. You look at the forward prices for electricity in mainland Europe now. These are incredibly high prices. It's really going to be hurting a lot of businesses having to absorb that and then pass that on to their end customers. So I think it's that balancing act between the need to do this at scale and speed, but also doing it in a way that isn't unjust for the end consumer.
What do you do with technology and robotic technology? I know, again, is there a danger that actually we're selling everything off, but our economies are changing, and so now is the right time to invest in some of these new companies?
I think you're completely right. We've got these themes. These themes are going to be fantastic to be able to back in your portfolio. We have proved through time that backing these themes is an essential way of getting outperformance when you're thinking about investing over the medium to long term. Sure, we're going to have cycles. We're going through a cycle right now. These are great opportunities to be able to top up, to reset your portfolio mix, to think about saying, well, I've missed the run of the last year or two. The theme is still very, very much intact. Now's a great entry point.
Evie, can I take you from the long term to the near term when it comes to commodities?
Politics.
What we're seeing in terms of the pressure. Well, politics, I'll leave that one to you. I'll leave that one to you, Francine. It's been all over the UK political story. In terms of the pressure that we've seen on Brent and WTI just over the last few days, are we starting to see now more sustained demand destruction? Is the commodities bull run starting to erode?
Yeah, well, there are some things that obviously consumers at the end of the day don't want to have to pay for at certain high levels, and you will see high commodity prices constraining consumption. Just the unaffordability. You know, you think about people having to make the choice: do I want to get in my car, fill it up, and drive the distances that we did, or will I look for an alternative? Will I do a little bit less driving because it is that much more expensive? Clearly, commodity prices at high levels have an impact on consumption. But when it comes to the things that we have no choice to do, the move to a green economy, decarbonizing the way that we consume everything in our daily lives, that isn't a choice. That is something that has to happen.
Yeah. I mean, are clients engaged with some of these longer-term themes?
Absolutely.
Or do they just worry about inflation? Because frankly, there's, we're going to see a huge cost of living crisis, not only in the UK, but the rest of the world. And we don't really know how central banks, we've put so much power on central banks, we don't exactly know, how much they can get us out of this mess.
Yeah, well, the answer to your first question is clients are absolutely engaged on this. I think the thing that we've had that's most consistently back from clients is that they want to try and understand it. This is an incredibly complex subject. If you've got to do something at that scale and at that speed, it is by default, it is complex.
Yeah.
So to help our clients navigate through this is an essential part of the work that we're doing in researching these themes. And the energy transition has to be the largest mobilization of capital over the shortest period of time that we've seen in hundreds of years. And we're weaning ourselves off 200 years of fossil fuel-driven power. That's a massive change in only 15 to 20 years. I mean, it's a big one that clients have got to work through. Yeah.
Hard if you don't have a working government.
A bit of a challenge. Arguably, we don't have that now. Let's see if that comes. Let's see if we get a government in the next. Let's get a government first, and then we can start to work through some of these big issues. Evie Hambro, just excellent on the near-term pressure we're seeing across commodities, but more importantly, arguably, on those longer-term thematics. Thank you for coming to the studio this morning. That is Evie Hambro, of course, Global Head of Thematic and Sector Investing at BlackRock. And coming up, Boris Johnson fights for his political life. Yes, as dozens of Conservative MPs quit his government and those resignations continue. The UK Prime Minister remains defiant, vowing to stare down mutiny. We are live in Downing Street with Larry the Cat and others. This is Bloomberg.
About what they call black soot caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
Crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 42 minutes into the European trading day. Global stocks on a high, at least for the moment. European stocks, you can see, gaining some 1.3%. Look, they're rising in Samsung Electronics, really boosted optimism for the latest earnings season report. So the angst that we saw in inflation and growth may be shifting as we go into this earnings season and expecting some better than expected figures, Tom.
Now, desperate and deluded. That is the front page of this morning's Guardian newspaper as Boris Johnson faces an unprecedented revolt within his government. Dozens of Conservative MPs have resigned from their roles, demanding he step down. The Prime Minister even sacked former ally Michael Gove from his cabinet. But Johnson, well, he remains defiant.
How's your week going?
Terrific. Like many others.
I mean, how's your week going? That was a killer. He's signaled that he will continue to fight for his political life.
You're asking about something that is not going to happen. History teaches us that the best way to have a period of stability and government and not to have early elections is to allow people with mandates to get on.
Now, for more, we're joined from Downing Street by Bloomberg UK reporter Lizzie Burden. So, Lizzie, is this a breaking point for Johnson? Is there any way that he can actually hang on?
Well, it's a test of Boris Johnson's dignity. How far can it stretch? The resignations just keep on coming this morning. Already he's lost Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis, the Treasury Minister Helen Whately, and it takes the number of resignations to almost a third of the government. It's unprecedented in recent British political history, and it doesn't just have consequences for Boris Johnson's political survival, but also for the business of government. MPs are complaining that legislative sessions to discuss upcoming bills are being cancelled. Ex-Brexit Secretary David Davis says that he's turned down a job in government. They just can't get the staff. The administration's paralysed. But Johnson, as you say, is saying he's going to fight on. He signalled that by sacking Michael Gove, seen as one of the most competent ministers in the government. And he's also said that he could announce a new economic policy or a mini budget as a turnaround measure next week. But what could be the breaking point? Next week, the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers is meeting. If it changes its leadership, changes its rules, it could vote Johnson out. But even then, it's not a concrete rule. It would then go to a vote of confidence in the House of Parliament.
Lizzie, we're just getting the line now crossing from the newly appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi, telling the Prime Minister that he has to step down. And I'm going to quote from his tweet. Prime Minister, this is not sustainable. It will only get worse for you, for the Conservative Party, and most importantly, for all the country. You must do the right thing and go now. That is dynamite from the Chancellor, who's only been in office for, what, a couple of days?
It's proper like Game of Thrones stuff, right? So he's appointed, and apparently he wanted the job, and then he's like, Prime Minister, it's time for you to go. I completely underestimated about how this would snowball so quickly. We thought that Boris Johnson could maybe survive this for a couple more weeks, but with his own newly appointed Chancellor, shooting him like that, I don't know how it ends.
Again, it just underscores the fact that the consensus in Westminster is not when he will go or if he will go, it's when and how that form and how that shape takes form. We will get the analysis now from Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, a former Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office as well over a number of years. Jonathan Portes, I'm sure you're much demand at this moment, so thank you for your time. What do you make? Let's start with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Zahawi, who's only been in post for a number of days, calling now on the Prime Minister to step down.
Well, I mean, I think, as you and Lizzie have said, the question of Boris Johnson is sort of in the past. It's just a question of when. So it's really about what happens next. I have to say, it's pretty hard to take seriously a Chancellor who 36 hours ago thought that Boris Johnson was the right man for the job and was prepared to accept the post of Chancellor in order, as he claimed at the time, to put forward a new economic plan. And now, 24 hours later, 36 hours later, is saying that the Prime Minister has to resign. So I think Mr. Zahawi's credibility is also gone along with that of the Prime Minister.
I mean, I would probably disagree with that because he's put himself at the forefront and he's now not seen as a loyalist. Does this not give him, good morning, it's Francine, does it not give him a better chance to become the next prime minister?
Would you trust Nadhim Zahawi at this point?
Well, would you vote for him? I mean, the question is, who else is there?
Well, indeed, and I think that's why it's very difficult. You know, it is, I think, easy to predict what happens next in the next few hours, probably at most days. The Prime Minister goes and we have some sort of leadership contest for the Conservative Party. It's much harder to predict who will win that, or from the point of view of the country, what that will mean for the UK economy, because of course, as we know, there are very different visions within the Conservative Party. There are those that we heard Suella Braverman just now saying that what was needed was to take advantage of the benefits of Brexit by wholesale deregulation and ripping up European rules. There are others within the Conservative Party who want a rather different approach. So, you know, we need, I think it is very difficult at this point to know where the country is going economically as well as politically.
Well, just to draw you out and, you know, digging on your experience on this, Jonathan, given that you've been a sharp critic, of course, of austerity, you're a sharp critic of the damage of Brexit. What should the policy priorities be of the new, let's assume, incoming government?
Well, I would say there are two big priorities, European and domestic. On the European front, here I think there is a genuine opportunity. The European Union had quite understandably entirely given up on Boris Johnson, not just on substance, but because they couldn't trust a word he said, like the rest of us. So whoever is next, from their point of view, will be at least someone who they will try to do business with. So there is an opportunity there to reset the relationship with the EU, to drop, for example, the threat to break international law by cancelling the Northern Ireland Protocol. So while relations with the EU aren't going to be easy because there are genuine issues of substance that have to be resolved, there is an opportunity to reset the relationship, to rebuild some trust. So I think there's a very clear imperative, whether it's a Brexiteer or someone who's less extreme, whatever their position of substance is, at least to reset the relationship and negotiate seriously, professionally, and in good faith in a way which Boris Johnson was simply incapable of doing. Domestically, I think the task macroeconomically is, as you say, I was indeed a critic of austerity. That doesn't mean that I think we should have massive tax cuts or fiscal stimulus now. The situation is very different. Austerity was damaging precisely because it was done precisely at the wrong time, when demand in the economy was too low. That clearly is not the position overall at the moment. The UK economy does not need broad-based tax cuts, a big cut in VAT, a big cut in income tax. So if there are candidates in the election, and I suspect there will be, who try to appeal to parts of the Tory party by promising massive tax cuts, that will be extremely dangerous and damaging in my view.
Professor, thank you so much. Jonathan Portes there, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, joining us. Now, coming up is the euro uninvestable. That's a call from some top investors. We'll discuss that as it goes to parity. This is Bloomberg.
Airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. Earlier today said that Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. There's a big celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 54 minutes into European trading day, gains of 1.2% across the European benchmark. Let's turn our focus now to Europe and the euro, and many traders are calling it unbuyable.
I don't know how to handicap the risk of the gas getting turned off. You know, I think if we had a give or take a stop in gas flows of any significant nature over the course of summer, autumn, I think euro-dollar will trade down at 1995 would be my first guess. Recession would be pretty much unavoidable.
Joining us now is Dana Al-Baltaji, our EMEA credit managing editor. Dana, how symbolic is this move then towards parity? Are we reaching peak bearishness when it comes to the single currency?
This is such a symbolic moment for markets because basically the euro has been through so much over the past 2 decades, and yet this is what's bringing it down to parity. It just kind of shows the sort of uncertainty that we're facing in markets with the possibility that Russia could, you know, remove its gas from the market, and it just showing just how scared people are that that could actually happen. There's a lot of uncertainty here.
Yeah, what's amazing is that it's scary, but actually it's not really, you can't feel the ripple across as we would have 12 months ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the thing. I mean, I think people are still trying to assess exactly how big of a risk this is and so on. But that's why people don't really want to trade it right now. You're also seeing this within the banking sector. People are starting to step back a little bit. They want to see how far this is going to go. This is a major repricing of the euro.
Dana, thanks so much. Dana Al-Baltaji there, our EMEA credit managing editor. In the meantime, it's pretty incredible, actually. I mean, talk about drama. I didn't know the UK politics could deliver such drama. We have the newly appointed Chancellor saying that Johnson should resign. Now, he has not resigned himself. This is, 2 days into the job. He was appointed after Rishi Sunak, of course, resigned on Tuesday night. And basically, he says the country deserves a government that is not only stable, but which acts with integrity.
The implosion of this government continues. You have the education sector as well. Just in post for a little under 36 hours, Michelle Donnellan saying and announcing that she is resigning from government. Again, being appointed education secretary just a couple of days ago when Sajid Javid stepped down in terms of his role as health, and there was a reshuffle. She is now resigning. So just that, an implosion. We'll have the latest, of course, on the ground from Downing Street and Lizzie Burden as this remarkable situation continues to play out in the halls of power in Westminster and Downing Street.
Yeah, we also have a fantastic live blog. I urge everyone to go and see it. If you're a Bloomberg Terminal user, they, for example, say that the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, will not be joining the resigners. This is Bloomberg.
companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The job of a prime minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going.
I actually think the curve is going to invert a lot more because we're going to get inflation next week. We're going to get payrolls later this week. The job market is still strong and inflation is high.
Almost everybody has reduced their expectations of demand for the year. We reduced ours by about 1,200,000 barrels a day. We're at the 2.5 million barrel a day level. That's similar to where the EIA and the IEA are, and I expect that we'll be seeing further downward revisions in demand.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Johnson defiant. The Prime Minister clings to power as the avalanche of resignations continues, including, well, the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi telling him he should go. We're live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive, Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation, plus path to parity. The euro is deemed unviable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession. Samsung sales boost sentiment in stocks. Now, first thing is first, let's check in on the markets, although I have to say we're all pulled in the direction of this drama in Westminster and the UK. I've never seen anything like it. It's resignation after resignation. I think we count about 50. And then the newly appointed Chancellor really writing quite a long letter explaining to the Prime Minister why he needs to go. He himself not resigning, but saying the Prime Minister needs to go, and he was disappointed that he had not listened to him privately. The markets, of course, when it comes to pound, focusing a little bit on that. We've been speaking to a couple of analysts and currency traders against the dollar. It's at 119.40, saying a lot of the political drama is already accounted, of course, in sterling. Certainly the fact the Prime Minister is now on his way out is probably priced in. What is not priced in is this inflation that could get worse and growth also getting worse. European stocks, though, overall getting a lift, gaining some 1.3% on the rally that we saw in Asia, and that's thanks to some of the tech stocks. Watch out for euro dollar. One of the most interesting moves is, of course, parity, and the fact that traders are pretty sanguine about this. It's not really infecting other asset classes. And then the U.S. 10-year yield, 2.9299. We heard yesterday from the Fed that they will deal with inflation at the risk of slowing growth. And then we look for the ECB minutes a little bit later. Now, across Europe, the other big story is, of course, gas. We saw France, for example, nationalizing EDF. This is a huge story. And I wonder whether we'll see some of these other countries, certainly in Germany, in Italy, some of the other governments are doing the same. And then the other big question is, of course, how do they balance the books if there's less and less gas coming from Russia? Now, desperate and deluded, that is the front page of this morning's Guardian newspaper as Boris Johnson faces an unprecedented revolt within his government. Now, dozens of Conservative MPs have resigned from their roles, demanding he step down. Even Johnson's newly appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi, says the Prime Minister must go. But Johnson remains defiant and has signaled that he will continue to fight for his political life.
You're asking about something that is not going to happen. History teaches us that the best way to have a period of stability and government and not to have early elections is to allow people with mandates to get on.
Now, for more, we're joined from Downing Street by Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, I mean, there's just too many resignations. There's just too much pressure on the Prime Minister. Does he resign or does he get fired?
Well, you would think that the moment for the podium to come out of number 10 would be now. The Chancellor telling Boris Johnson in public that he needs to go. Of course, he told Boris Johnson privately yesterday, but today he's come out with a letter and a tweet about it. The tweet says, "This is not sustainable. It will only get worse for you, for the party, and most importantly, for the country. You must do the right thing and go now." Crucially, he is not resigning, the Chancellor, but the number 2 of the government is holding the number 1 hostage in number 10, forcing him to resign. And it's not only Zahawi, it's also the Education Secretary, Michelle Donnellan. She has resigned from the job. She's only been in for a matter of days. She was appointed this week. So Johnson looking extremely weak now.
So what happens next? Is it, you know, I know there's probably a vote of no confidence next week, but with more resignations, how can he actually hold on?
Exactly, because the business of government is paralysed. The government just cannot get the staff to replace the vacancies that keep on coming. It's almost a third of the government that has gone now. And we're having reports of Tory MPs turning down positions, including former Brexit Secretary David Davis. So the legislative agenda just cannot move forward. What could happen, as you say, the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers could change its rules and have another confidence vote. If that doesn't push Johnson to resign, there could be a confidence vote in Parliament, or the wildcard option, Johnson could try to call a general election, but it's thought that the Queen would refuse that because he doesn't have the support of his party. Remember, this is a Prime Minister, not a President.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden there with the very latest from Downing Street. Now joining us now, Hannah Smith, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Hannah, thank you for joining us. So much drama out there on the markets. I mean, there's inflation, there's growth. Now there's this political drama. I mean, where do you see some of the value in assets? I mean, currencies are really all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on the show, Francine. Great to see you. At the moment, where we're seeing value is really in some of the defensive sectors. So we have seen a flight to defensives given that these recession concerns have really come to the forefront. So we're looking at defensive, but really quality defensive. So healthcare, where we're seeing the strongest free cash flow within the defensive sectors. It's also got strong momentum and it's not looking expensive at the moment. Also dividends. So dividends offer good, very strong quality, and obviously the yield factor as well is really important. And for us within our range at Spiders, we've seen a third of all inflows this year go into dividend products. So that's really where we're seeing value and seeing demand as well from investors.
I'm breaking some news from the Daily Mirror. This doesn't happen every day on Bloomberg, but according to the Daily Mirror and one of the most respected journalists there, number 10 staff have been told that Boris Johnson will resign. Hannah, when you look at all of the political drama, I don't know whether it changes how you look at the UK. I don't know whether it's priced in or whether you actually make a line because the UK has bigger problems, growth, inflation, and of course the interplay of the two.
Absolutely. So there's two different elements. So we've got the UK stock market, and that is really quite insulated from what we're seeing in UK politics. The UK stock market is very defensive, and there's big international companies. They get a lot of their revenue overseas. So we're not necessarily seeing much of this play out within the UK stock market. That investors are liking at the moment, just as they're looking for defensives in this challenged market. But what we're seeing, obviously, on the economy side is there are a lot of challenges there. We're seeing high inflation at the moment. There's the added pressure of Brexit. We've got a very tight labour market as a result of that. We've also got got the UK energy price caps, and so we're likely to see inflation go higher than what we're seeing in the US and also Europe as well. So the UK has a lot of challenges, particularly on the economic side, but we're not necessarily seeing that play out in the stock market.
Yeah, I mean, does it happen? I mean, it's really impacting sterling. And again, I don't know how much of it is a political drama or how much, again, is this growth versus inflation concern. What does it mean for the UK economy?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge for the UK economy. Obviously, they are still, in terms of where inflation is likely to be, as I mentioned, it's a lot more challenging than what we're seeing in the US and Europe. But I think the benefit that the UK economy has is that it did start hiking rates first, not as aggressively as the US, but it has been realistic about where it's seeing recession
Hannah,
risks.
sorry, let me just confirm that we have our sources now also saying that Boris Johnson plans to resign as British Prime Minister. Let's quickly also look at pound. The impact on sterling had already been priced in. That's what a lot of senior analysts had been telling us when it comes to pound. Boris Johnson, Bloomberg, of course, sources saying that Boris Johnson is planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Hannah, then we get on to, I mean, I don't know whether it's election or certainly they'll need to find a new Tory party leader. And then the question is it someone that's as pro-Brexit or not pro-Brexit? Does that change actually how you view the economy as investable?
I don't think there will be a huge change just because Brexit, you know, we've already left the European Union. And so Brexit, I don't think there's going to be a question around that. I think the main focus that we would look on is how they're going to fight inflation and the impact.
Taxes,
Exactly.
So that's austerity, taxes.
Exactly.
It's like some of these big things. I mean, at the moment, it's unclear who would get it and so who would become the chancellor as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of these things, obviously, it's breaking news, so it's still to play out as to who will replace him, what will their approach be on the economy, but so far what we're seeing is that the Bank of England is committed to tightening, and that should, and committed obviously to bringing down some of those inflation numbers.
Yeah, so just moments ago, Bloomberg saying that Boris Johnson is now planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Hannah, are we expecting too much from the Bank of England? So we have the governor, they've enjoyed relatively stability for 10 years with this ultra-low monetary policy. Now it feels like they need to fix growth, they need to fix inflation, employment. Are we putting too much burden on the Bank of England?
The Bank of England, it has a lot of challenges and arguably more so than the other developed economies. Brexit is a huge burden on the UK economy just because it has resulted in a very tight labour market, and this is going to be a big challenge when they're trying to tackle inflation that we're seeing. So I think there are likely to be a lot of challenges within the UK market. As I mentioned, I think the Bank of England is committed, however, and it's been quite firm in its stance on rising rates, and it's done so quicker than some of the other larger economies. But it's definitely one to watch, and more is to see, where to see more play out.
Hannah, thanks so much. Hannah Smith, their Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Just minutes ago, Boris Johnson planning to resign as British Prime Minister. This is according to Bloomberg sources. We are extremely well sourced, especially in the Westminster team. So we know that this is true, but we don't know whether or when this happens, whether this is a matter of time, a matter of hours or days. Coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on UK politics. The drama of the last 48 hours with the Chancellor, Mr. Zahawi, saying Boris Johnson must go. And then minutes ago, Boris Johnson, according to Bloomberg, planning to resign as British Prime Minister. This is Bloomberg.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
It was 4 minutes ago that we saw that headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal, Boris Johnson will resign. This is according to an official. Before that, it was according to Bloomberg sources. Now, what's happening, according to the people on the ground, also we have a fantastic live blog following really blow by blow what's happening in the drama at the moment that is the UK politics, saying that the usual number 10 meeting resulted in Johnson's core team telling him he had to go. And then according to, of course, a brilliant reporter at the Mirror saying that not only is he resigning, but actually his letter has been prepared. The pound just hitting a session high as a headline crossed the Bloomberg terminal. Boris Johnson planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Now, for more, we're joined from Downing Street by our very own Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, I mean, everything seems to be going much quicker than expected. Does he resign in the next couple of hours?
Yes, well, the cars are moving. We're expecting the podium. You're hearing reports from Downing Street sources that the Prime Minister is preparing to call it a day at Downing Street. It seems that the letter from the Chancellor, newly appointed Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi, was enough to push him to his limit. The resignations had mounted. It was more than almost a third of the government had quit their jobs because of Johnson's integrity over the Chris Pincher affairs handling, the cost of living crisis, the Partygate scandal. It had all been building and government was paralysed. So Johnson, it seems, can do it no longer. What would be the next options? Well, he could, in his speech, say that he's going to set out a timeline for the leadership elections in the same way that his predecessor Theresa May did. Or he could leave immediately and hand over to a caretaker Prime Minister. We expect it would be Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, who has remained loyal. But for now, finally, it appears that it's curtains for Boris Johnson.
Yeah, we're just getting some breaking news, Lizzie, and it's quite difficult to, of course, verify everything. But this is according to the PA agency, saying a new Tory leader is said to be in place by October at the party conference. So I don't know whether we could see an election very quickly or whether they need to wait for the summer recess. Talk us through the process there.
Well, it's an internal process that the Conservatives will choose their own next leader. And remember, in the past, it has been extremely heated. Remember, Boris Johnson sacked Michael Gove yesterday. It was a surprise, but part of that has been seen as revenge for when Gove sabotaged. It was seen Boris Johnson's own leadership ambitions back in 2016. There are lots of runners and riders in the field, one of them Nadeem Zahawi, the Chancellor, but the question is, has he tarnished his own reputation now by being the one that has potentially pushed Boris Johnson to the edge? There's also the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He was seen as the golden boy for a long time, but then his own reputation was tarnished by the scandal over his wife's tax affairs, his handle of the cost of living crisis. He too has quit. He's on the backbenches. He could potentially organise a leadership bid. There's the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. She's kept very quiet in recent days. Perhaps she will be the one. But this is where the attention turns to next. Who will be the next leader?
Yeah, who will be the next leader on the Chancellor? Lizzie, thanks so much for some great reporting there on the ground in front of number 10. And keep us posted if you see a podium or any movement. We know there the cat tweeted he's not going anywhere. Lizzie Burden at number 10. Still with us, Hannah Smith, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Hannah, when you look at ETFs in the UK, And maybe let's stay in the UK just because it's such an extraordinary story. Now we understand, of course, that the new Tory leader is set to be in place by October at that party conference. I mean, what do the markets want? Do they need a leader and at least some clarity now? I mean, this is probably the worst time for a government to go. It's high inflation at a 4-year high. We need to know about tax cuts. We need to understand what the next budget looks like.
Absolutely. I think this is, a really crucial moment, and that was really what Boris Johnson was hinging on, that the UK economy really needed some guidance. And so I think what will be crucial for the market is to understand who is going to be the predecessor and what is going to be their policy and how are they going to tackle this high inflation, the cost of living crisis, and the other issues existing in the UK economy.
Do you see the economy changing, given what, again, I don't know whether this is a country that will need to do much more fiscally, and that's the only way to support growth?
Yeah, I think that it definitely needs to do more fiscally. Obviously, at the moment, we've seen a 25 basis point rate hike. We expect to see more, and I think that they're really, given inflation is set to peak after summer and probably around 10-11%, that's going to be the key focus of the government and also what's needed to be addressed in order for inflation to come down and the UK economy to shore up.
Hannah, let me make sense of what we know so far. So first of all, the Prime Minister, we understand, is planning to resign. This is according to 2 officials familiar with his thinking. And this, of course, follows unprecedented wave of resignations from his government in the past 2 days. We also understand that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, could stay as caretaker UK leader until October. So it's unclear exactly when the election process is. Hannah, how critical is this for the UK economy? I mean, Boris Johnson staying as caretaker, is that what the markets want? Because it's really a lame duck prime minister.
Absolutely. I think that arguably it provides some sort of continuity to the UK, and perhaps the market may see that as a positive sign. I mean, we really have to see how it does take it. My guess is that it might be helpful for there to be, not a vacant, any vacant space left. But I think it's still to be seen how it will play out.
Okay, also watch out for the memes, because in this drama, some of the memes are quite funny. I think Iceland posted something like, "If your cabinet is empty, come to Iceland." Hannah, thank you. Hannah Smith there, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. So the latest, Boris Johnson planning to resign as UK Prime Minister. This is according to officials that spoke to Bloomberg. Other media press are also reporting that the letter has already been written, but he would stay on as caretaker until October. We'll have plenty more, of course, on this UK political drama. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So it was exactly 11 minutes ago that we heard the news, Boris Johnson to make a statement, well, to the country today, but actually it was 11 minutes ago that we found out he was resigning. This is according to two sources that told Bloomberg we're expecting either a podium or maybe it's a video message. We're not 100% sure, but we are expecting some kind of statement today. The pound hitting a session high as we got confirmation that the Prime Minister will be resigning following these series of resignations by Conservative MPs. Now, for more on market reactions, let's bring in our very own Danny Berger. Danny, we saw a bit of a liftoff, a tiny move when it comes to pound.
Yeah, we're still under 120 here, so still a lot of weakness coming from sterling, but gaining around 0.5% immediately on that headline. I have to say, Francine, some of the reactions I'm getting, and I was just talking to Sebastian Gailey over at Nordea, for example, that one risk this perhaps removes is that around Northern Ireland. There were some fears of that creating weakness in the pound, so that's maybe where we get some of the gut punch reaction. But Sebastian also highlighting that one of the big risks, of course, is political uncertainty. Who replaces him? What comes next? What do those policies look like? Viraj Patel also throws cold water on the idea that this can continue to strengthen the pound. He calls this move a head fake, writing on Twitter that, no new Tory leader has a magic wand to change the UK macro outlook, the UK current account deficits, and that's what's been driving the pound lower, no matter how much the BOE talks about hiking rates. So this is still a UK currency that is dominated by the macro picture. At the same time, Francine, anytime we do see some strength in the pound, it does tend to benefit those domestic stocks. So if you look at, for example, the smaller cap index, the FTSE 250, you can see there's an immediate jump in here as well, almost up about 1%. Again, how long will this last? Is this just gut punch reaction, Francine? That's the question to be asking right now.
Danny, thank you so much. Our Danny Berger there with the very latest on the FTSE 250. We'll have plenty more, of course, from Downing Street. Boris Johnson set to resign as UK Prime Minister. He should stay as caretaker until October. This is Bloomberg.
Energy prices and a short supply of key chemicals that produce synthetic fertilisers are sending pig, cow and horse manure prices soaring. Even human waste is in demand as farmers hunt for alternatives. Fertiliser helps increase crop yields.
You can see how much moisture is held into this. It's a lot of organic material into the
compost, so it breaks down, the manure and the straw breaks down into a friable mix that can be mixed into your soil in the ground and for growing a whole range of different vegetables. Holds the nutrients in, holds the water in, and it really increases the kind of biodynamic profile of the soil.
The recent price spike could mean more farmers going organic for the long term.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Boris Johnson plans to resign as British Prime Minister. We're live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation. Plus, path to parity. The euro is deemed unbuyable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession. Samsung sales boost sentiment in stocks. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson bowing to the inevitable and plans to resign. That's according to two officials familiar with his thinking following an unprecedented wave of resignations from his government over the past 2 days. Well, joining us now is Bloomberg's opinion columnist Marcus Ashworth. The very latest is we also understand that Boris Johnson will stay as caretaker, UK leader, until October, and he will make a statement to the country on Thursday. Marcus, first of all, this changes everything on the economy. What do we know about, first of all, we don't know, of course, who's the next prime minister, but what should the next chancellor should be thinking about? It's taxes, it's austerity, yes or no, and it's, of course, what they do with debt.
Well, weirdly, I think he needs a bit of extra time to find somewhere to live, but beyond that, I do think that the markets aren't reacting particularly to the political situation because, there's nothing that any new Prime Minister or Chancellor matter that can really do to alter the macro outlook on the UK economy or the world economy, or indeed the strength of the dollar against sterling is, look at the euro going towards a 20-year low. It's got nothing to do really politically with the weakness of sterling. It's all about the strength of the dollar. You look at the FTSE, it's holding up well as an equity market reasonably, and that the small caps aren't as well. But it's the gilt market which is the only real barometer of what happens next. And they are handling it pretty well. Big redemptions coming up, shortage of supply. Any new chancellor and prime minister is going to open up the fiscal taps. And we're going to cancel a bunch of tax hikes coming through on corporation, possibly on national insurance, and they will spend more. But there is plenty of flexibility in the gilt market to do it, which is weirdly why sterling markets just aren't reacting, because bigger forces at play. That hideous strength of the US dollar is far more important than really a bit of storm in a teacup politics.
Yeah, Marcus, does it change the relationship with Europe at all going forward, or why are markets, pretty relaxed about it? As you say, storm in a teacup.
That's it's quite a big teacup domestically, but in the global sort of
quite
economic
a big storm.
picture, yeah, quite a storm. But the thing is, I think that's the only positive news potentially coming out. If we find someone who's got a more, it's hard not to see how that can't be portrayed by a positive. Even someone like Rishi Sunak, who would probably be the most sensible choice markets-wise, either him or probably Sajid Javid, are the only ones who've got any clear economic background that we know about. Not to say others couldn't do, it's just we don't know much about their views and approach. So I think, if Rishi Sunak were to come in with a much more conciliatory approach, I think Europe would take it as a big positive that they weren't dealing with Boris Johnson. And I think that could be a long-term fillip. But I don't think it's an obvious one, and that's why I don't think sterling's reacting that much yet, because, but that would be the only positive thing, short term for sterling, but there are bigger pressures with that strength of the dollar, I think.
Marcus, thank you so much. As always, Bloomberg Opinions, Marcus Ashworth. He was also on our podcast, actually. It was quite a fun podcast. Of course, it's been completely upended by a lot more resignations, but you should listen to the In the City podcast as well. Now, joining us for more on the UK drama story, Ben Sills from our politics team. Ben, at this point, because Boris Johnson is resigning, this was, of course, confirmed to Bloomberg by 2 officials. Who are the Conservatives that could become the next Prime Minister? Are we actually looking at odds at the moment, or is it still too soon?
Well, I'm sure someone will be drawing up the odds. I think in no particular order. The people that you want to be looking at are Ben Wallace, who's the Defence Secretary. He's a kind of like solid, old-fashioned Tory, like a safe pair of hands type figure who's had a good war. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, traditional Thatcherite, quit as Chancellor this week as part of the wave of resignations that ultimately looks like they brought down Boris Johnson. Or maybe Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who's like a much more kind of hardline, more Boris Johnson style politician, who's a big favourite of the party faithful.
Ben, and given these are very different personalities, of course, what do you think will be the most pressing issues? I know it's the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's NATO, it's support to Ukraine, and then domestically what they do with taxes and other things. What do you think the next Prime Minister will be elected on?
I think, to be honest, I think the Tory party is really tired of the chaos of the Boris Johnson years. And I think that the chaos actually predates Johnson's time as Prime Minister. The Theresa May years were pretty chaotic as well, largely because of the Brexit movement that Johnson was driving. So my bet would be that it would be one of the more conventional, perhaps slightly boring figures. If you remember back in the 90s, it was John Major, the famously grey figure who they picked to follow Thatcher. And I suspect the party might be in the mood for something a little bit calmer.
Ben, you've been covering politics and government for over a decade. If you look at Johnson's resignation, and this is a great fact from our T-Live blog, which I have to say your team are doing a great work on, this is basically the 4th leader within 6 years that will have gone. David Cameron resigned in 2016, Theresa May resigned in 2019, and then Johnson will resign in 2022. Are UK politics changing because of that?
Absolutely. I think that this dates back to the Brexit referendum, which kind of opened up a new rift in British politics, and it took us to a place where the government is focused on delivering a policy that, in many ways, doesn't make sense in economic terms, and yet the government has to this point been determined, kind of like already committed to claiming that it works, and that just leads us into all sorts of crazy situations like we've seen with Boris Johnson, threatening to start a trade war with the EU while we're supposed to be maintaining a united front over Ukraine. So I think that there's going to be a fundamental reset here, not necessarily or complete with this next Tory government, but I think we've reached the end of the kind of the crazy first phase of the post-Brexit vote.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us. Ben Sills there from our politics team. Joining us now is Jill Rutter, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Jill, how problematic, first of all, good morning. How problematic is it for the UK economy not having a functioning government? And what does that mean for the Bank of England? It seems it's just giving more pressure on Governor Andrew Bailey.
Well, it's clearly not optimal, but I think the Prime Minister's decision to resign has at least resolved something. For the time being, because I think it was possible that this chaos might have continued into next week, but the Prime Minister does now seem at least to have accepted the inevitable. It's not at all clear what happens, or indeed who is Chancellor. And as Marcus talked about Rishi Sunak as Chancellor, Rishi Sunak is not Chancellor at the moment. That's Nadine Zahawi. What we hear is that the Prime Minister will continue as caretaker through till there is a new Conservative leader. But will he really do that? Will people come back and serve in his cabinet? and who is the Chancellor. We'd been promised this big economic reset speech next week. Rishi Sunak said one of the reasons he resigned was that he couldn't agree the content of that speech with the Prime Minister. There were real arguments between the Treasury and Number 10 about where the economy should be going. We assumed that when Nadeem Zahawi was appointed 2 days ago, that Number 10 had found a chancellor who might be a bit more in tune with their thinking, but Nadeem Zahawi this morning said he thought the Prime Minister should go. Do they work on that speech? Do we get that, or do we have to wait for a budget till the autumn? All of this is completely uncertain at the moment.
So, Jill, what happens to the UK economy? This is, gas prices. There's only 3% of gas from Russia in the UK, but it's gas prices elevated. You have a cost of living crisis, and it's extremely difficult to see how they can get a handle on inflation without killing this economy off at a time when we don't really have a working chancellor.
Well, it was pretty unclear what they could really do about inflation anyway, even if they took measures. I mean, they were talking about measures that might affect the headline rate, possibly a VAT cut, though I think Treasury orthodoxy would say that was extremely unwise when you have an economy where the real problem is too much money chasing too little supply, driving inflation. So it was never really clear what the government would do. We had actually, on the day that all these resignations were triggered, one of the measures kicking into effect that the previous Chancellor Rishi Sunak had introduced to deal with the cost of living crisis, which was a big hike in national insurance contributions thresholds that was sort of benefiting about half the working population. So it may be that we don't expect anything very much for the time being. Of course, the Bank of England is independent, so its course of tackling inflation, maybe more hikes and interest rates to come. They'll be meeting again in a couple of weeks' time.
Jill, does this country need tax cuts, or do tax cuts fuel inflation? And so is that the worst possible pill for it?
It's we've just, as I said, just had sort of a biggish tax cut, but coming on the back of a whole bunch of tax increases to slightly offset the cost of living effects. I'm sure that the Treasury will be saying that this is not the time for unfunded tax cut. We've also got massive public spending pressures on the other side of it. We've got big backlogs post-pandemic in public services. Some real hitches. It's very difficult at the moment in the UK to get a passport quickly. Court services blocked up, big NHS waiting lists, so huge demands there. And the other thing we're seeing is very big pay demands across the public sector and the quasi-public sector.
Jill, Keir Starmer also just tweeting, the Conservatives have overseen 12 years of economic stagnation, declining public services and empty promises. He says we need a fresh start for Britain. If there were to be general elections, who do you think would get in?
At the moment, the way the polls look, it would look relatively good news for Labour, but very complicated because they might very well depend on doing some sort of deal with the Liberal Democrats, who are obviously formal coalition partners with the Conservatives, and potentially also with the Scottish National Party, which continues to dominate politics in Scotland and which has already said that it will regard any upcoming general election as a de facto referendum on independence. So we don't know how that would play out. At the moment, the Conservatives don't look in a good place. I don't think that there's that much prospect, though, of an imminent general election, simply because I think so many Conservatives who would have to decide whether they want a general election would regard this as potentially a recipe to bring in Labour. That was, after all, one of Boris Johnson's reasons for staying, was that otherwise there might be a general election with the threat of a Labour government.
Jill, thank you so much. As always, Jill Rochwether, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Now, this is what we know so far. It is 9:41 UK time. Boris Johnson has agreed to resign as Prime Minister. He will make a statement today. We have all eyes on Downing Street. We don't know whether this is a virtual statement, whether it's one of a tweet, some of the videos that he pushes out, or whether he'll actually come out of Number 10. Whether we see the Prime Minister or not will be front run by a podium. Our Lizzie Burden is also on the ground, and so she'll give us an update if she sees any movement there. Boris Johnson, we understand, will stay as caretaker leader until October, the pound hitting a session high. This is Bloomberg.
has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is bowing to the inevitable and plans to resign. That's a Bloomberg story, agreeing to resign and making a statement today. For more, we're joined by Downing Street by Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden. She's where the action is. Lizzie, it must be extremely exciting. It is quite a small road, actually, for our international viewers. It's a windy and small road. What's it like on the ground? Are you seeing movement? Are we expecting a podium to come out?
Well, Francine, the way it's happened was there was a steady march of staff going in looking like they knew something, and then the cars started to move, and then it was the cameras. I can tell you on the other side of the camera, it is heaving with the world's press to cover this historic moment. Boris Johnson has finally got to the point no one thought he would get to, that he will resign. It didn't come last night, but after that cabinet meeting, the usual cabinet meeting this morning, it seems to have pushed him to the edge. And of course, you had the letter from Nadeem Zahawi, the Chancellor, telling him to resign. Zahawi himself not resigning, but in a sense, the current cabinet holding the Prime Minister hostage and forcing him to the edge. Boris Johnson says that we're hearing that he plans to stay on as caretaker leader until the fall. Notably, it would be a shorter tenure than his predecessor Theresa May if he went right now. But if he carries on as a caretaker, then it will be longer. We'll look forward to his speech. There isn't a sign of a podium yet, but if you remember when Theresa May left, there were tears. Wonder what the tone will be when it's Boris Johnson's turn.
I mean, apparently he gets in a fighting mood when things get tough. Lizzie, almost 1/3 of government has gone following a string of resignations. How will they actually choose the next leader?
Okay, so there are two stages, and it takes several months. The timescales for each of the stages is set out by the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers. The first is about the MPs, the shortlisting stage. So they put themselves forward, and there's likely to be a wide pool of candidates. And the idea is to, over several rounds, whittle those Tory MPs down to 2 and keep out extreme names. The second stage, then, is it goes to the grassroots members of the Conservative Party. It's a ballot of the party membership to narrow it down to the next leader. But of the candidates who are the runners and riders, they're split. There are those who have remained loyal to the Prime Minister, which in itself could be tarnishing, and then there are those who have already resigned. Rishi Sunak, the ex-Chancellor, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary who got this ball rolling, to the party membership. To have stayed or to have betrayed the Prime Minister could be what makes their minds up.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden, they're outside number 10, and of course you can see the door open. Larry the cat, we know, is staying because he is not attached to the Prime Minister. Now let's just get straight to our Bloomberg Economics Executive Editor, Stephanie Flanger. Stephanie, great to speak to you. I mean, we'll talk about economics in a second, but you follow these cycles of politics, especially in the UK. Is the next leader going to be more boring than Prime Minister Johnson?
I think by definition, he's going to be more boring. He was clearly, it's amazing, we're talking about him in the past tense already. Of course, he's not talking about himself in the past tense quite yet. But you know, he has been, throughout his career, let alone his political time in office, one who breaks the rules and overturns what you might expect from a Prime Minister. So, of course, there's a kind of steady as she goes desire. But there is a fundamental, and Lizzie's sort of signalled to it, there is a bit of a problem here because all of these people who now profess themselves to be shocked by the lack of ethics in their Prime Minister and all these things that, of course, we've all seen for almost since he came in office, they are all all a little bit tarnished. I mean, the people who stuck around till now, or even till a few months ago, are tarnished by that time in office. So if you're a Tory member, which, as we heard, they're going to be the people who make the final decision, and certainly if you're a voter, you're not necessarily going to be looking for someone who is closely associated with the Boris Johnson government. But then there'll be some who say, no, we have to be true to his election result and that 80-seat majority. So some will say exactly the opposite of what I've said.
But Stephanie, how difficult is it, for example, to lose a government in this really crucial months where inflation is rampant, 40-year high, there's a downturn in the economy, and there needs to be decisions about taxes, austerity, budgets, and debt?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult time, especially when you're going into the sort of summer period where traditionally loads of big things happen and Parliament's not sitting, but you need an effective executive to be working out what's going on. I mean, I think even the sort of short-term task of, okay, these 50 plus 60 people who've left the government, will they come back as caretaker ministers in order to just allow the ship to keep on sailing through the summer? And as you suggest, there is a fundamental debate about whether the government's done enough to support people with the squeeze in living standards coming down the track. The Bank of England, as we know, and we talk about most of the time, has the biggest job here, and probably the most important job. But that question about how policies can help households get through this, how much are teachers going to be paid, who's going to make that decision in the next, there are currently no ministers at all in the education department.
And it's not really playing out on markets. I mean, you saw a little bit of a bounce for sterling, but not huge. But does this put extra pressure on the Bank of England to be more careful in restoring growth? Because you have a vacuum in politics.
I think, I mean, of course, they're focused on inflation, and then the debate has been, are they behind the curve on that? How can they weigh the risk of a recession against the very desperate need to bring down inflation? I think so they've already been fairly cautious on that in terms of interest rate rises. I think that will probably continue, but they would say that none of this really fundamentally affects what they're looking at when they think about that decision. I mean, if we had the Prime Minister stagger on with a new Chancellor who's talking about tax cuts, well, at the margin, that could mean a looser fiscal policy. We can't even say that now because we're not sure who the Chancellor's going to be.
Is there an economist, or do economists have a favorite? I know first of all, the Bloomberg Live blog on the UK drama politics is extraordinary. So the Trade Minister, Penny Mordaunt, viewed in the party as having a strong pro-Brexit credential. So actually, the odds from betting firm Ladbrokes says is one of the favourites to succeed Johnson. Then we have Ben Wallace, Rishi Sunak. This is according to Adair Doyle. Are these pretty much kind of similar candidates in terms of how they deal with the economy?
They're fairly well known, not to the public necessarily, but they're well known to policymakers. They've been on the scene for a while. But there's this interesting game, as Lizzie described. There's this two-stage process. You don't need to necessarily have the majority of the parliamentary party in your favour. You just have to be one of the last two, and then of course things can change. So that's interestingly why people like Penny Mordaunt, Tom Tugendhat is another possibility, Ben Wallace, people who actually had roots with the military, interestingly enough, play very well with conservative grassroots, and that's why they're sort of coming to the fore when they haven't necessarily been in the sort of front line of politics for the last few years. But in terms of economics, very hard to judge. I mean, obviously we know what more or less what Rishi Sunak thinks, although he said he has to compromise a lot with number 10. In terms of economics, I think none of those figures are people who've established themselves in, for a long time in the Treasury or an economic policy job. So they would be pretty unknown quantities on that front.
Stephanie, it's really all about fiscal support, right? Is that the one question that you wish we'd know for the next Chancellor?
I think there's also, there's a fundamental thing. When we talk about price wage and wage price spirals, these decisions on public sector wages are pretty important. And the decision on the private, I think we've already probably made the decision on whether we're going to fully uprate the state pension, but that in turn has consequences for demand in the economy. But I think that the crucial decisions are going to be on these public sector wage rises and how are they paid for, crucially. If you pay 9% to teachers, are you going to pay for that with reduced education spending or increased fiscal expansion?
Yeah, and it's, more people also want an increase. Stephanie, thank you so much. As always, Stephanie Flanders, they're our Bloomberg Economics Executive Editor. Now, this is what the pound is doing. It did get a little bit of a lift, hitting a session high as we got confirmation that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will be resigning following this unprecedented wave of resignations from his government over the past 2 days. So to look at the market reactions, here's our Danny Berger. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Francine. Yeah, we've almost done a round trip here. We did get a spike up in the pound. at one point pushing close back to 120, but we're almost back at the levels we had before we learned that Boris Johnson would be resigning. Similar story when it comes to domestic stocks as well. Those initially spiked on the report. They started to come back down to earth as well. Now, I just got off the phone with Kit Jukes, who of SocGen, very generous with his time since he's also trying to bash out a note right now on this. But his main takeaway, he said, was that if you remove sort of the wider macro story, which of course is the main driver, we should say, of the pound when it comes to gas, when it comes to inflation, this story of Boris Johnson leaving could be one that is seen as pound positive, perhaps why we got that gut punch reaction. For one, it's been very hawkish fiscal policy. The departure of Rishi Sunak, perhaps a new government in place, could mean more leniency there. At the same time, it might help to remove some uncertainty, some of the unfriendliness towards Europe when it comes to things, especially like the Northern Ireland Protocol. All those things would be positive sterling. But there's just so much uncertainty, be it economic or political. And if there's one thing FX markets do not like, it is political uncertainty. Sebastian Galli over at Nordea also pointed out, we just don't know if the next person will be centrist or more extreme. So a lot of uncertainty baked into the picture here. But of course, Francine, we should say that sterling strength, that initial sterling strength, easily undoing itself at the moment.
Daddy, thank you so much. I love our Bloomberg Live blog saying we're about to see a beauty contest. There'll be a wide field of conservative leadership contestants that now will want to look very attractive and to try and persuade their fellow MPs to back them. Trade Minister Penny Mordaunt, viewed maybe as one of the leaders in this contest, having strong pro-Brexit credentials, charisma, and good leadership qualities. Ben Wallace, Rishi Sunak, according to Ladbrokes, this is a betting company, second favorites. Now, Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller and Kay Lines in New York. Our Anna Edwards is here in London. What we know is that Boris Johnson has agreed to resign as Prime Minister. He will make a statement today. All eyes, of course, on number 10. Is there a podium to come out? Is he going to make a live statement? Is it this morning? Is it this evening? We don't know. So stay with Bloomberg for the very latest.
almost the end of the year, but Bali is still quiet and empty. I am here in Kuta Legian, one of the main walking streets here that is used to be a tourist spot for beach, dining, shopping, but many shops here are still closed. Most of the outlets are either for rent or for sale as they have run out of business.
Saya kerjanya di sini udah lama, udah ada 10 tahunan di sini kerja. Masih sepi sih, nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu kan rame, sekarang ya ada 1-2 itu ada, tapi nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu rame sekali. Sekarang paling dapat jualan ya 100, 120 gitu, 200 ya. Kalau dulu sih ya nyampe dah 1 juta, 1,5 tuh nyampe dapat jualan. Bisa sampai 2 juta dulu. Sekarang nggak pernah lagi dapat segitu. Sama aja. Belum ada turis ke Bali. Masih ya domestik aja.
While Bali has reopened its borders for foreign tourists since October, they're still not coming in. Many international airlines are yet to reinstate their direct flight to the island. Balinese people here really hope they can see more people from Australia, China, and Europe to come visit next year.
a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kayleigh Lyons.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kayleigh Lyons here in New York. Anna Edwards is with us from Abingdon Green in London. Our top story today, Boris Johnson will call it quits after an unprecedented wave of resignations from his government. The question is now, can he even stay on as a caretaker PM until October when a new leader is chosen? We have you covered from all angles in London, in Brussels, in Washington, D.C. We've got Lizzie Burden at Downing Street, and we'll start with her there. Lizzie, what have you got?
Well, it started with the staffers walking in, perhaps to give a good internal goodbye. Then came the cars, and then came the cameras. And on the other side of our camera, it is heaving with journalists from the world's press for this historic moment. We're expecting to hear from Boris Johnson by noon London time. There's no podium yet, but it'll be interesting to hear the tone of his speech. Remember his predecessor, Theresa May, it was tearful. Will Boris Johnson, more like him, be cracking jokes? Who knows? But what happened is that the usual number 10 meeting resulted in Johnson's core team telling him that he needed to go. The straw that broke the camel's back seemed to be this letter from his newly appointed Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi telling him to resign. And there was this unprecedented wave of resignations, leaving the government paralysed, unable to function. So Johnson has, we're hearing, is planning to stay on as a caretaker leader, though, as you say, we're also hearing that there's pushback from some MPs even on that point. But it's interesting to point out that Boris Johnson leaving today without being a caretaker would have had a shorter tenure than Theresa May, currently standing at 1,079 days. Theresa May, 1,106 days. If he stays as a caretaker, he could beat his predecessor, but perhaps he'll be hoping that he can make a comeback like his hero in politics, Winston Churchill.
Lizzie, yes, I'm sure he'll be hoping for those parallels. It's often said that people go slowly at first and then very, very quickly, and this does seem to have been gaining momentum over recent days, of course. Sketch out what happens from here. We, of course, in the very immediate future, look for a podium to appear where you are in Downing Street.
Yes, and it turns now to the question of a leadership election. That would take two stages over several months. In the first stage is the shortlisting. MPs put themselves forward to be the next Prime Minister, and it's a wide pool of candidates that want the top job. The idea is to then whittle it down to two names to keep out the extreme ones. And the second stage goes to the grassroots of the party. It's a ballot of the party membership, but and then we come down to one name, but the names are split into two camps. You've got those who have left the government already and perhaps will be seen as traitors, and then there are those who have stayed and are perhaps tarnished by their proximity to Boris Johnson. Those who with strong economic credentials could be important, because let's face it, we're in a cost of living crisis in the UK, but those with military credentials could also be front runners, because there is a war in Ukraine. The next stage will be this leadership election.
All right, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden reporting from Downing Street. Thank you so much. Let's get to the market reaction now to Boris Johnson's plan to resign. Bloomberg's Danny Berger has been tracking the moves. And Danny, initially it was a stronger pound, though that spike has reversed a bit.
Exactly. It was a gut punch reaction, and now we stop, we rethink what this actually means. It wasn't just pound higher, it was also yields higher and domestic stocks higher as well. Now, I just got off the phone with Kit Jukes asking him, why would this be the reaction? He says, look, if you just boil it down to politics, he wouldn't be selling sterling right now. And folks are not selling sterling, I should say. It's still up by about 0.4%. Essentially, you have some of the uncertainties or
Connection
the drama
lost.
taken away of the UK's interaction with the EU. If it's the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, that has a less contentious debate with the next leadership, that would be sterling positive. The UK, we have to remember, very hawkish fiscal policy right now, too. If that changes, that's also supportive to sterling. Kit Jukes puts it thusly, it is a soap opera, and its conclusion, if it is Johnson leaving, then that is one that is sterling positive. But the other thing to remember is that markets, FX market stocks, they hate uncertainty. We have uncertainty right now. Sebastian Gailey over Nordea said, we don't know whether the next government in power will be centrist, whether it will be something else. So that keeps investors on the sidelines at this moment. Of course, others say, look, in the grand scheme of things, it's all about the macro policy. It's about inflation. It's about gas in Europe. Those are things that are going to continue to put pressure on sterling. So regardless of what happens at 10 Downing Street, it is a negative economic environment for the UK. And just a change at the helm of government won't change that, Anna.
Danny, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Danny Berger with the latest on the market reaction to the politics as it unfolds here in the UK. She mentioned gas prices. That's very topical, of course. Inflation, one of the factors very much on people's minds here in London. Maria Tadeo is covering that from a European perspective. Our European correspondent joins us now from Brussels. For Europe's potential response then to this news first, Maria.
Well, Anna, I have been on my phone now for 20 minutes trying to get a comment, really asking for a comment to European officials on the political drama that we see and play out in the UK, and I've gotten no responses. But clearly they watch and they're interested in everything that happens, potentially the repercussions of a new government. And I think overall, Anna, this really reinforces two things. One is that European officials really believe Brexit unleashed forces that have made government in the UK very unstable. Therefore, that makes the bilateral relationship between the EU and the UK also unstable by nature. And then the other thing, and this is where it gets interesting when you go into the future, the forward-looking statements potentially, is that, again, it reinforces the idea that for the EU, it's best to stay calm and not touch or renegotiate anything, purely because prime ministers come and go, Brexit secretaries come and go. And then think about this. If 2 weeks ago, Šefčovič had agreed with von der Leyen to open up the entire protocol, who would he negotiate with in the next 2 weeks? So again, it reinforces this idea that for the time being, it's best to stay calm, not touch anything, and then just wait and see what plays out in the UK.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. Maria Tadeo there in Brussels. Anne-Marie Horton is standing by in Washington, D.C. With Anne-Marie, the context here is what we really care about in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. It got rocky between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Has it changed with the Biden administration, and could it change without Boris Johnson?
Well, there's certainly some hurdles, and you remember at one point during the campaign trail, President Biden had called Boris Johnson a physical and emotional clone of his fierce competitor, Donald Trump. So there were some hurdles in the beginning, but they got a number of issues done, including the nuclear submarine deal, including Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom really supporting this administration as they have these sanctions on Russia and want to continue that pressure on President Putin. But the White House here is dealing with a number of domestic issues, and most notably, as Danny was talking about, the UK economy is dealing with its higher food prices, higher gasoline, inflation. So this administration is just going to look for a partner who could deal with global issues that's going to help their domestic problems, like higher inflation. We haven't gotten any statements yet, but I imagine they're going to be very much so that they'll deal with anyone working in Downing Street, because there is a special relationship, as they have dubbed it themselves, between Washington and London, and they'll want to work and continue that relationship with the British people.
Anne-Marie, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton bringing us the latest there from Washington, giving us a response to this breaking news that we are bringing you this morning, that we understand and we are expecting Boris Johnson to resign as the UK Prime Minister. Anne-Marie will be heading to the to Hay Adams, where she'll be part of a Bloomberg surveillance special today in Washington. We'll hear from Brian Deese, National Economic Council Director, and Heather Bouchy, member of the Council of Economic Advisors, amongst others. So there's plenty of politics to talk about stateside, of course, as well. Coming up, we discuss the fallout from Boris Johnson's expected resignation. Ben Page joins us, CEO of the polling company Ipsos Mori. That's coming up a little bit later. We'll get a market perspective, of course. Anna Stupnitska joins us, Fidelity International global macroeconomist. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management. It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This week, June jobs are in focus.
I think we're all very curious how June jobs came in.
The labor market is tremendously strong.
We have never been in a recession with declining unemployment.
This Friday, the surveillance team will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
There's so much uncertainty. We're going to have to monitor the data closely.
Everyone needs to recalibrate at 8:31 a.m. this Friday.
The June Jobs Report, Friday on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards, live in Westminster with Matt Miller and Kayleigh Lyons in New York. A busy day for UK politics. Back to our top story. Boris Johnson plans to resign. Joining us now is George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor at The Sun, influential newspaper, of course, here in the UK. George, really interesting to get your insights. Let's start with the here and now. We expect to hear from him soon. We expect him to resign then. What kind of tone, what kind of Boris Johnson do you think we will get here? Because I imagine he is still pretty angry about some of the things that have been happening in the last few days.
Well, he is very angry, and he's still of the opinion that he has in some way been damaged by his own people who've been very self-interested. He takes the view that he was elected by 14 million British people only a couple of years ago, and that they're still behind him, and he's still got a mandate to deliver. And let's be quite clear, Boris Johnson sees himself as a Churchill figure, and he regards his place in history very, very strongly. And I think very clearly you will hear a sense of that. There'll be no sense of remorse and regret. He will try and make clear that he is doing the bidding of his party for the good of the country. But you can be absolutely sure that he is being dragged out of the door here against his will.
He is being dragged out. This is a parallel he likes to draw between himself and Churchill, of course. Where would you expect him to go next, George? Is this? I mean, he's still going to be a member of Parliament, of course. He'll still have a job to do if he chooses to carry on doing that. Not all former prime ministers do.
Yeah, most former prime ministers leave the House of Commons. Theresa May did not, but most of them do. I think the Prime Minister knows that he's got a very lucrative career ahead of him as a commentator, as a writer. He's got a lot of books in him. He likes writing historical novels. And I think there's plenty of that for him in the future. But you might find that actually he moves away from politics on the front line because, to have been the Prime Minister of the country, to walk into the job finally and then be hit by the pandemic, being unable to deliver what he had intended to do, to have Brexit mostly done but not fully done, and to not really achieve his ambitions, I think will be very hard for him. Don't forget, of course, he's the father of two very, very young children with his wife, Carrie, and it may well be that it's the time for him to move more out of the public eye.
George, does Boris Johnson really have a political ideology, or does he just sort of throw populist spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks?
What a great question. And I think that this is the biggest problem that Boris Johnson has had, is that he is very free of ideology, really. He is somebody who does care about the environment. He's really, really quite passionate about net zero and the climate change problem. He does care about the City of London. When he was the London mayor, that mattered to him. But these are more sort of subject areas that matter to him. What he really cares about is being a leader, is being a winner, is being the top dog. He loves being loved and he hates not being loved. These are attributes which are not great for a prime minister because it means it makes it hard to make the tough decisions. And if you are not driven by a guiding light of ideology, then it's kind of hard to deal with the management country, particularly in these extraordinarily turbulent times in which we live now, where decisions have to be made instantly and huge issues are happening all around us. Change is happening. Very hard if you are constantly being buffered around by the latest opinion poll or the latest person you don't want to upset. And I think perhaps that has been one of his biggest failings. He would say differently. He would say he is populist. He is responding to the electorate and giving people what they want. And of course, that's true up to a point. But of course, in the end, if you are not guided by a strong ideology, a strong mission with purpose, it's kind of hard these days to keep a strong, consistent line.
Well, we hear differently about Rishi Sunak, right? He's actually concerned about the fiscal picture, and that hasn't made him incredibly popular in these tough inflationary times. Is he the lead contender to replace Boris Johnson?
Well, a couple of things on that. Very, very good point. So firstly, is he the lead contender? He is one of the leading contenders. It's not quite clear yet whether he has a campaign. I think he does have a campaign, and he might team up with Sajid Javid, the health secretary, who resigned suspiciously within 5 minutes of Rishi a couple of nights ago. So that looks like there may be a dream team there. But he's not the front runner. He's not the front runner for a number of reasons. He's not massively known amongst parliamentarians, the Conservative members of Parliament, who are the first choosers here. Let's not forget that's the audience that matters. And here's this whole point about the fiscal position. Nadhim Zahawi, who is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, looked at what he was being asked to do over the last 12 hours, literally over last night, which was to cut taxes, to cut corporation taxes, to cut VAT, to cut personal taxes. And he realized that the global markets would see that as a crazy thing to do, and that would almost certainly result in the debt price of British debt being raised, and of course that would have consequences for our repayments. And he felt that that was going to be very bad for Britain's economic standing. That is exactly the Rishi Sunak position as well, which is why Rishi Sunak refused to do what Boris Johnson wanted him to do, and that's why Rishi Sunak was had to resign, essentially.
Well, George, we can talk about Rishi Sunak or any of the other contenders and their likelihood to actually become prime minister in October. But before we even get to October, can Boris Johnson realistically stay on as caretaker over the next 3 months?
it's a really, really tough choice for the Conservative Party. Many of them don't want him to stay. Many of them want to hand in the seals of office today and to go by tonight, and Dominic Raab would be the caretaker over the summer period. They think that Boris Johnson, whilst maintaining power, will continue to perhaps do damage to either the country or the Conservative Party. Others, however, think that there is an important sequential moment here, and it's important to have the Prime Minister still in post to create some continuity and for ministers to carry on governing. So there is a bit of a clash right now in the Conservative Party about whether he should go or not. And it is possible, definitely, for him to stay over the summer months, but many in his party feel that would be damaging to the party.
But hasn't all the damage to the party already been done? I mean, we focus on the man at the top, but isn't this a larger Tory problem?
Right. So this is the big problem they're about to have. They've already got a problem because of what are the events that have led to this incredible day. So the breakdown in competence, the breakdown in some people's behavior. And it looks like this is a party in shambles. But that's nothing as to what we're about to see as the Conservative Party goes through a 3-month leadership battle with many, many contestants, which will inevitably be seen as hostility towards each other, briefing against each other, negativity. And the message to the voter is these guys need to go away and sort out their differences and then come back when they've got their pain sorted and they've got a new leader. And that's going to be very damaging, I think, to the Conservative Party, which is why a number of very senior Conservatives are telling me today what they're trying to do is to urge 2 or maybe 3 of the top candidates to come together privately and agree amongst them that one of them, 2 of them maybe should go to the party and say it's going to be us and nobody else. That's a hard trick to pull off, but they're doing that because they can see the potential damage of a 3-month leadership contest.
George, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor of The Sun, giving us his perspective on UK politics. I'm pleased to say I'm joined here in Westminster by Lord Robert Hayward, Tory peer and polling analyst. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Lord Hayward. Thank you very much for joining us. So we get ready for our 4th leader in 6 years. I feel like for a markets and economics presenter, I spend a lot of time in Westminster these days. Robert, what's your perspective? Let's look back briefly. What's your perspective as to what went wrong? Because there were a whole lot of things you could choose from.
Boris is a great personality. That's what actually appealed to a large section of the electorate. That's his strength, but it's also his weakness. And what has gone wrong is his inability to understand how very large sectors of the electorate feel about indiscretions.
About indiscretion. So this goes back to Partygate.
It goes before Partygate.
Yeah, to the other scandals.
It goes to expenses and all those sorts of things, Owen Patterson's expenses issues. So yes, it's an attritional process, but it's overwhelmingly to do with personality rather than policy.
And breaking the law or getting close to it.
All those sorts of things. This is the first leadership election that I've seen, and of both parties over 30-odd years, that has been about personality. Most leadership elections are to do with policy.
How does the Tory party find somebody to fill those shoes? Because personality-wise, they are big shoes to fill, but I suppose we've all come a long way. We know a lot more than in 2019.
We do, but I don't think any organisation sets out to find the same person, and because they couldn't anyway.
So what's the antidote?
The alternative, though, I think there'll be quite a big field, because I think the view the Tory party will take is, well, there's 1.5 years, 2 years to the next general election, gives the opportunity for a new Prime Minister to get bedded in. I think it's likely to be a Brexiteer, but somebody who can bring the party together. Although, ironically enough, the events of the last 72 hours have probably meant that actually it's become pretty unified against Boris Johnson.
So that's one of the things in his legacy, I suppose, already.
Sadly, yes.
Some ability to unite the Conservative Party. Do you find your candidate yet Robert, have you spotted an individual you're backing?
I spend my time doing the analysis and watching the moves of the different candidates. Some of those potential candidates have actually been preparing their leadership election for a while. It's the reality of politics. But they will all now come out into the open. Suella Braverman, much to my surprise, announced an interest in running yesterday.
Just resigned as Attorney General.
Absolutely, and I know Suella very well. I've chaired many of the selections for these people when they were chosen as candidates for their constituencies.
International financial audiences will be familiar with names like Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, Sajid Javid, who was also Chancellor for a brief period, and then Health Minister. Are we likely to see those big internationally recognised names at the forefront, or is this a time for newcomers?
I think you're absolutely right. It will be a combination of both in terms of the field. Those that America and the viewers from the Middle East and the Far East will recognise, but equally names that are unheard of. But the markets get used to new names. They're faced by them all the time.
We'll have a different tone, whoever takes over. Too early to say, of course, what kind of direction policy will take. Can we say anything about which direction policy will not go in as a result of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's expected departure?
I think there are two issues here. One is the period from today when Boris says he's going to stand down, and the issue now for the Tory party is to say whether he is going to be allowed to continue as acting Prime Minister but not policy directing Prime Minister.
Do you think he will be able to be any kind of caretaker?
He wants to be, from what we're hearing.
Which is that surprising to you?
Not surprising about him, because that's Boris.
Right.
But I do know, my sense is that it's going to be difficult when you have many ministers resigning because they're saying, well, actually, you lack integrity and decency. It's very difficult to then say, well, I'll serve in a government with the same person still as Prime Minister. So that's a battle over the next 3 or 4 days, unless it's resolved today. Then you get to the next Prime Minister, probably a Brexiteer, but somebody who has a manner that can bring the party together, probably a less confrontational, more policy-driven.
And just briefly, does the process have to last till October? These things can be accelerated. It was, I remember, after David Cameron resigned.
It's very difficult because we're so close to the summer recess. And if, as I expect, we're going to have a lot of candidates, I think it's going to be virtually impossible to compress into 2 or 3 weeks.
OK, so we have months of this to look ahead to.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Lord Robert Hayward. Thanks for spending time with us here. Tory peer and pollster. Coming up on the programme, we'll get further perspectives on all of the evolving politics here in the UK. More on Boris Johnson's expected resignation. We'll speak to Ben Page, CEO of the polling company Ipsos Mori. The public doesn't get a say in this. This is down to first Conservative MPs and then members of the Conservative Party. But he will have a good take on what they think and what they would like to see from a new leader as well. This is Bloomberg.
nuestro estudio, nuestro experimento, no hemos pintado todos los edificios de blanco, sino estos más asequibles de pintar. Y ya hemos detectado reducciones medias en el área metropolitana de 0,8 grados aproximadamente en un periodo de ola de calor y con picos máximos de 4 grados de disminución en un momento puntual del día, en una zona puntual del día. Y como dices, en una ciudad como Barcelona funciona incluso mejor que las zonas verdes. Según las modificaciones, nos detectan incrementos, o sea, disminuciones de temperaturas mayores con tejados blancos que con incrementos de zonas verdes como tienen planteados el plan director urbanístico.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
I'm Anna Edwards from Westminster with Matt Miller and Kayleigh Lyons in New York. A big morning for UK politics. We understand that Boris Johnson is going to call it quits after an unprecedented wave of resignations from his own government. Matt, I stopped counting at 50, but he got over 50, the number of cabinet ministers, other ministers and their aides who resigned from the government payroll, an expression of dissatisfaction with Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership. The game is then up, the fight is up, and he looks set to resign. We just wait for that podium to be wheeled out into Downing Street. We've seen it a number of times before over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see if he can stay on as caretaker PM, if he'll even be able to build a government with the few backbenchers that he has left, and of course, who will follow him as leader of the Tory party, Anna. So there's still a lot we have left to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Kayleigh, we've got markets, of course. We haven't even mentioned the Fed minutes yet.
No, we haven't, committing to that hawkish policy, but it really speaks to the moment we're in, Anna, that this comes at a terrible time for the UK economy. You have inflation running rampant, consumer confidence on a downtrend, serious growth concern out there. It leaves monetary policy in a really tough spot, and now there's serious question marks as to the trajectory of fiscal policy given this shakeup at the very top of the UK government.
Yeah, and yet global assets, despite the political distractions here in the UK and the threat of tighter monetary policy, risk assets have been finding it within themselves to go higher, certainly in the early part of the European trading day, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't seem like markets have reacted to this at all. We saw the pound at 119 before. It's still at 119. We saw the FTSE up 1.25%. It's still up that. S&P futures currently up about 0.25% right now, so a little bit of optimism in terms of risk assets, and you do see investors willing to let go of the 10-year debt right now, pushing the yield higher. So a march back to 3%. Remember the question we've been asking about U.S. yields is, did we peak at 3.5, or are we headed back there right now? NYMEX crude has come back down under $100, but it's headed up again. Right now only 64 cents to 99.19, but for Texas Intermediate, that's probably welcome respite to the Biden administration and U.S. consumers. And then Bitcoin right now moving only 0.4% and still holding at that $20,000 level. It's really been interesting to watch it get stuck at these big $10,000 round levels from 40 to 30 and now 20. Kayleigh, what do you see in terms of pre-market movers?
Yeah, we love those round numbers, Matt. There is actually a lot going on beneath the surface of the equity market, even though we're so focused on the macro picture and the politics picture today. One of the big stock stories is GameStop. It announced after the bell yesterday a 4-for-1 stock split. Now, we know that doesn't change anything fundamentally about the company, and yet it always seems after these announcements, the stocks rise. The idea being it makes it more accessible to retail traders who will then come in and buy, and you are seeing buying for that stock this morning. It's up about 10% before the bell. Another stock moving higher is CGen. This is after a Wall Street Journal report that Merck is in advanced talks to buy the company for $200 a share. That stock trading at 180 this morning, up about 3 percentage points. And finally, overnight in Asia, we got positive results out of Samsung, the South Korean giant. Better revenue growth than expected eases some concern around demand in the chip space. And as a result, a lot of chip stocks moving higher in the U.S. pre-market session. Applied Materials up 2%, AMD up about 1.4%, Anna.
Yeah, and important to pick up on that thought as we look at European assets as well then, Kaylee. Let's check out where we are on the European story. And the day started really positively, actually, despite, as I say, all the political distractions. And we did actually see the pound getting a lift higher as we got that news that Prime Minister Boris Johnson intends to resign. Some of that has been unwound now, but we see European stocks have moved a little bit higher today. And we focus on the pound, of course, because of the politics. Mining stocks have been doing quite nicely. That's on the back of a bit of a rebound that we saw in some of those mining names, some of those mining underlying commodities, I should say. But that was a bit of an unwind of a previous day's move. And ST Micro, coming back to Kaylee's point about what's going on at Samsung, ST Micro, one of the European chip names, moving higher on that story. Let's get back to the UK politics. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden is in Downing Street, and she is fighting for position with the rest of the global media and looking out for the arrival of that podium that signals that the Prime Minister is going to make a statement, at least I assume is going to happen in Downing Street. I mean, we saw Prime Minister Cameron make a speech from there. We saw Theresa May make her very emotional speech from just where you are, Lizzie.
Yes, Anna, soon we'll be touching elbows. First the cars came, then the cameras, and still there's no podium, but the crowds are gathered beyond the gate, beyond the security at the end of Downing Street. Finally, we're at the moment where Boris Johnson is expected to hand in his resignation today. It came after a wave of resignations, unprecedented in recent British political history, paralysed the government, and it had seemed increasingly inevitable. Of course, you've had the Pestminster sex scandal, the Partygate scandal, and the cost of living crisis, all building too much pressure for these MPs, ministers to bear. And Johnson says that we're hearing plans to resign but stay on as a caretaker leader, but even that is now facing opposition. We're hearing pushback from MPs, one saying that he's poison, that it should move over to Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister. But in any case, it's a humiliating end to a political career as someone who won a landslide majority only 3 years ago, the biggest since Margaret Thatcher.
Well, and Lizzie, you speak of all of the resignations that led up to this, and those are continuing. The Environment Minister, Rebecca Powell, just issuing her letter of resignation. Who's going to be left to hold things together between now and October?
It'll be interesting to divide the leadership candidates between those who remained loyal and those who quit on Boris Johnson. The next stage is this leadership contest. It splits into 2 stages. First of all is the shortlisting section. MPs put forward their own names. It'll be a huge pool of candidates, but it's whittled down to 2 names, and the idea is to keep out extreme ones. The second stage then goes to the grassroots members of the Conservative Party and whittling it down to the 1 name. But the timescales for each are set out by the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers. If it takes until October to find a new Prime Minister, it only gives the next Premier 14 months to set a new agenda before the next general election.
14 months seems like an eternity, Lizzie, so that should be enough. Lizzie Burden reporting from Downing Street. Joining us now is Ben Page, CEO of polling company Ipsos. Ben, I wonder what you think is the straw that broke the camel's back. Was it really this Pincher scandal? Was it Partygate? Or is it actually an economic story? Is it actually that the concern
on being the best party to manage the economy? And so I think it's more the endless scandals. Most British people don't think Boris Johnson tells the truth. And to be honest, we never elect the leader who is seen as most honest. But the Conservative Party under his leadership has fallen to pretty much its lowest ever score in Ipsos's long-running series in terms of being fit to govern. We have only 21% of people who believe that they're fit to govern. It's collapsed over the last 12 months or so. And it's that I think is finally it's the straw that broke the camel's back with his own party. So we'll see, but it's not the economy per se. It certainly doesn't help. And I do think that this leadership battle that's to come is going to be fundamental in how Britain decides to deal with inflation, and of course then what might happen on interest rates. Because you could see a populist leader from one of the runners and riders coming in and cutting taxes, which is likely to make our inflation problem last even longer.
Okay, yes, it certainly does seem to have become very personal and very much about Boris Johnson and his leadership, his style and his abilities. You suggest that we could see a populist coming in and cutting taxes. What are you thinking there of Nadine Zahawi? I mean, do we have any names yet when you mention that, Ben?
All I would say is that most polling, when you ask about possible leaders for a political party, is almost worthless, because it's usually, or very often, the one that people haven't heard of. And I suppose Nadine Zahawi might be one of those people. He's not that well known in the country, well known inside the Conservative Party, but it's often a surprise. You may remember back in 2005, David Cameron was relatively little known, and beat the much better known David Davis. Tony Blair, in the run-up after the death of John Smith, was again relatively little known in the country. John Major was not the favourite at the time Mrs. Thatcher had her problems in 1990. So it may well turn out to be someone that we haven't really heard that much from.
Well, Ben, you talked a little about the UK voter, just kind of the general feeling of the UK populace right now as it deals with this cost of living crisis, with inflation. Does domestic political turmoil like this just exacerbate those consumer confidence issues? I'm wondering if there is a broader economic ramification here.
Consumer confidence in the UK is currently at pretty much a historic low. It's back in the 2008 or 1980s level. We've been tracking it every month since 1978. So it is a pretty low level, but that is more about the economy and what people are feeling in their pay packets.
Right, but does political uncertainty make that worse, I guess is the question.
To a certain extent, but I think that's more for the pundits and for the media. The public are looking at how much do I get each month and how much can I buy? And that really, rather than the politicians per se, is the issue. At the same time, it's true to say that the proportion of people in Britain who spontaneously, without any prompting, tell us the biggest problem facing the country is not the economy, it's just the politicians themselves, is at an unprecedented 1 in 4 people. So almost as many people are saying it's the politicians are a problem. But in terms of how people feel about the economy, it is the real world and what they can actually buy with their money.
Okay. Ben, back to the process of choosing the new leader. I spoke to Lord Hayward just a moment ago, and he was saying this could be a long process, partly because so many candidates will put their names forward. After the Brexit votes, there was a sense that the country needed to move on quickly and get a leader quickly, and so one was found very quickly. Do you not think, then, that this will be in any way a condensed process, and we could have to wait months to get a new leader?
No, I mean, the way the Conservative Party rules, unless they change the rules, as they were about to before he said he was going to resign, because the rules mean that if somebody doesn't come through clearly in the first round, they will go off to this vote in the country with the membership. And so the challenge is that the Conservative Party remains very divided, and this is one of their problems. Boris is a catalyst for this, but actually there isn't a clear successor that unites the left wing of the party, or the One Nation Conservatives, the right wing of the hard Brexiteer element of the party. And so I think it's quite likely that we will have turmoil for some period to come until they finally settle on one individual who will have a massive task in uniting the party and then ultimately the country.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight today. Ben Page there, who is the CEO of Ipsos. Now, coming up, lender, borrower, and investor Sam Bankman-Fried is all things to the bankrupt crypto broker Voyager, and we learned that his company, Alameda, had actually taken a huge loan from the exchange. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kaylee Lyons with Matt Miller in New York and Anna Edwards from Westminster. Well, we've talked a lot about UK politics today, but we want to venture over to the crypto universe because Voyager's bankruptcy filing provides a bit of a roadmap into the company's relationships, including borrowers, lenders, and investors. And it turns out Alameda Research, the trading firm co-founded by crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, is all three. Emily Nicole, Bloomberg crypto reporter, joins us now. So Emily, we already knew that he lent Voyager money. It turns out he actually also owes them money and he's invested. It's the whole trifecta. Explain.
Yeah, so it's day 2 since Voyager filed for bankruptcy, and the filings that are coming out of that are showing us quite a map between Alameda and Voyager. Alameda lent Voyager around $485 million in a mix of crypto and US dollars a few weeks ago because of the chaos that's happening in crypto markets at the moment. And now that Voyager's filed for bankruptcy, we learned that not only is Alameda still owed $75 million of that, but it also has a $377 million loan to Alameda from Voyager. So it is both borrowing and investing. And on top of that, it has a more than 9% stake in the business. So there's a lot of different risks at play here.
This is, to me, the most puzzling part, Emily Nicole. Why on earth would Alameda have borrowed money, now more than it's owed, from Voyager?
Well, I can't pretend to know the thinking of Sam Bankman-Fried on that one, but it is something that is inherent in the crypto industry. It is becoming incredibly apparent that a lot of intermixing goes on between different players, and it's something that's really causing a bit of a headache right now. It's why so many crypto lenders are struggling, because there is so much contagion across different assets, different players. So many companies are exposed to the fallout of 3 Arrows Capital, a hedge fund that is in the process of going bust at the moment. And whether or not crypto will ever be able to recover from this interweaving web is a matter for the future to decide.
Emily, thanks so much for joining us. Emily and Nicole there, Bloomberg crypto reporter, talking to us about Voyager and Sam Bankman-Fried. Be sure to catch Bloomberg Crypto every Tuesday at 1 p.m. New York time, 6 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. That Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. There's a big celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
The last thing this country needs, frankly, is election. The earliest date that I can see for a general election is in 2 years from now.
That was the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson testifying to the Liaison Committee just yesterday. A lot's happened since then. We were talking then about whether he might be tempted to call an early election. It looks like he is going to resign. We wait for him to do so, but that is the understanding now. Let's get to the economic implications of all of this. Anna Sipczynska joins us, Fidelity International's global macroeconomist. Anna, good to have you with us. Thanks for coming to talk to us on Bloomberg. So from an economic perspective, we know a lot of the challenges facing the UK economy, and a lot of them, frankly, are international. They may be made worse by local, national, post-Brexit dynamics here in the UK. But do we expect any big changes in policy or any big revised ability to stand in the way of those international forces from a new leader?
Because, as you say, a lot of the shocks that the economy is facing now is already in the pipeline. These are the shocks that are coming from the outside. And I think one thing from a macro perspective, we would of course focus on the potential changes to fiscal policy and what this means for the BOE. But for the time being, as we won't have probably information on fiscal policy for now, at least for the next few weeks, I think the BOE is on its own, and they have to do what an independent inflation targeting central bank has to do, and that is to get control of inflation. So if anything, I think the interest rate path, the promised path, remains intact.
Some people have been suggesting if we did see a chancellor and a new leader who wanted to cut taxes, then that frees, in a sense, the Bank of England to do more hiking. Does that make sense, Anna, for fiscal and monetary policy to work in opposite directions in that way?
Well, again, if the BOE needs to control inflation expectations and inflation, they will have to lean against the fiscal policy. And this is happening, obviously, at the time where growth signals are flashing red. And the UK is very likely to go into recession, whether it's a short technical recession or a longer one is unclear. And potentially the fiscal policy would be looking to cushion this. But I think these are the forces that mean that the interest rate will likely to go high given the inflation backdrop.
What about the rest of Europe, Anna? I mean, is a recession likely this year?
Yes, we have actually been looking at indicators, particularly focusing on expectations for the next month, the next quarter that we get from the surveys. And they are all dropping very sharply, not just in Europe, but in the US as well. And that reinforces our view of a hard landing. And Actually, we think that the recession is imminent. It's more imminent than is generally believed in the markets. It is imminent in Europe and it is imminent in the US.
In that case, are the ECB's hands tied to an extent? I mean, we see the euro right now just cresting $1.02. It fell obviously below that yesterday, and many people are calling for parity. Is that inevitable?
I think the ECB or generally central banks are still focusing on inflation and the implications for inflation expectations. Growth concerns are entering their thinking, but they have told us, both the ECB and the Fed in particular, that they will be following data and they will not be proactive. They will be reactive to the data. They follow labor markets, the unemployment rate, they follow inflation, which are quite lagging indicators. So it seems to me that for the time being, the focus will remain on inflation for the next couple of meetings or so, while growth damage is already being done.
Anna, we might have lagging indicators, but we have very live spot prices on commodity markets. And in terms of those gas prices, they could jump, you know, who knows how high if we don't see Russia turn back on the taps after expected maintenance work later on this month. I know that's a sort of niche point, but it has big implications. How weak does the European economy get if that is the case, just briefly?
I don't think it's a niche point. I think this is a systemic shock, which takes time to unravel. And of course, Europe is more vulnerable, but actually the rest of the world is also vulnerable to the shocks from the war in Ukraine. And our base case is that the gas flows will remain at these low levels. They will not go up. And that means rationing potentially going into winter, as inventories will not be built up to the level that's necessary. And that could mean quite deep recession in Europe.
Okay, Anna, thanks so much for joining us. Anna Stupnicka of Fidelity International giving us her thoughts on the UK economy and the European economy beyond. That is it for Early Edition. A special edition of Surveillance is coming up. They come to you live from Washington. I and the rest of the team will be here in London as well. This is Bloomberg.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
pushing the Fed right now and saying, how much longer is this rate hiking cycle going to last?
Anything that's sensitive to the economy is just being taken out of the woodshed and destroyed right now.
Take a deep breath and not be so negative on equities. We've priced in a lot of risks so far this year.
We do think that the economy will be able to withstand higher overall interest rates.
Right now, I think we can confidently say we're not currently in a recession.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Live from the nation's capital for our audience worldwide. Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Live on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene. I'm Jonathan Farrow and TK. The focus not on the building behind us as we open up this program this morning. The focus on number 10 Downing Street.
Number 10 Downing Street with Lizzie Burden there and Anna Edwards there. It is a movable story. We're going to go to that. It will be with us through surveillance this morning, but a lot more going on in the economy, in inflation. Let's not forget this jobs report for America in 2 days.
Pushing forward to Payrolls Friday. Looking forward to catching up with Brian Deese, the National Economic Council Director here in Washington, D.C. But Tom, let's start with Boris Johnson and a bit of perspective. There is a mechanism to deal with these things. For the British public, they're staring down the barrel of another Conservative Prime Minister.
And he's fighting the mechanism right now. I was stunned by what Ben Wallace says. It's the first thing I thought about, folks. This is essentially the defense minister for the United Kingdom. How does Boris Johnson affect international policy, particularly the war in Ukraine, where he's provided real leadership under these circumstances?
With great difficulty, clearly. But as you mentioned, and it's an important point, he has been a tremendous ally for this administration.
Yes.
A tremendous ally for the Ukrainians as well. Tom, going from here, I don't think that's going to change for the British government. What we need to focus on is policy and how policy is going to change with a new Prime Minister, with a new Chancellor. And who that Chancellor is, I have no idea. And how that policy is different to what we've seen from Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Chancellor Sunak.
And we're advantaged with your perspective on this, John. The shock of Corbyn to Johnson, the linkage of those two together, is unprecedented.
I would agree with you, Tom, but at least we understood the Corbyn philosophy, the ideology. Do you understand what it was under Prime Minister Boris Johnson? I think a lot of people are still struggling with that. A lot of people are still struggling with that, Tom.
We're struggling with sterling a little bit stronger here today. I mean, we're going to do the data check, and we've got lots to talk about, but within the milieu right now, the markets is all we have to grab onto.
Yeah, without a doubt. And Tom, if you speak to people in foreign exchange, and we've been doing that through the whole week so far, talking about the UK, they won't talk about the political situation, Tom. That doesn't come up. They talk about the Bank of England, Governor Bailey, and what's going to happen with central bank policy. And that brings in the euro too. I can't figure out whether central bank rate hikes, so the ECB or the Bank of England, are currency positive or currency negative. So you're in the foreign exchange market right now. What on earth do you do, Tom, whether it's the UK, Europe, or the United States for that matter?
How do you run a bond book? I mean, behind us here and on radio, the White House and the Washington Monument, behind us, Jefferson in the distance, they're not running a bond book, are they? But the bond book right now, the vol in bonds, I've never seen.
Let's be clear, I think some people might say the Federal Reserve has been running a bond book, Tom, for quite a while, and probably the biggest bond book on Wall Street. But Tom, you bring in the Fed. Yesterday for the Federal Reserve, those minutes confirmed what a lot of people were already thinking. This Federal Reserve determined to hike interest rates again this month, potentially by 50 or 75 basis points. They're going again.
Is it already dated? The minutes are X weeks old. Is it already old news, or they have to reform their narrative, their story, as they stagger to July 27th?
Think about the context for the minutes. It's really important. Yes, they're dated. They always are, just by definition. But there was this window of a couple of days right before that Fed meeting where they switched from 50 basis points to 75. And all the reports started to come out around that. And of course, the minutes were colored by that shift. From here, what are we looking at now? Subtle signs of deceleration in this economy. Subtle signs of deceleration in this economy that this administration ultimately will have to deal with. Just subtle signs, but not big enough in the view of, say, Citi, Bank of America, to stop this Federal Reserve from hiking again.
Subtle signs, folks, is British for data dependency. They're staggering from data to data, and I'm sorry, claims today.
Sure.
It's not a presumed jump. I believe it's 220. That's a good number. That'll be something Jerome Powell can sit on. But the jobs report tomorrow is really, really important to that subtle detail you're talking about.
Would you define, though, labor market data as closing the barn door after the horse has bolted?
Yes,
Is
by
that
definition.
the barn door data? And if you think about it that way, Tom, if we're waiting for the labor market to break before this Federal Reserve pauses,
then haven't we already committed to being too late and inflicting too much damage on this economy?
That's the arch central
Isn't that
bank
what this market's
discussion.
picking
This
up
is
on?
ex post ex ante, and the bottom line is these central banks plural. And imagine how Governor Bailey feels this morning with the nation essentially politically collapsing. The bottom line is they wait for the data. That's what they've always done, and they'll do that this time.
Well, the good news for Governor Bailey is the attention's not on him right now. The attention is firmly elsewhere. Let's talk about some of that. We can do that right now with equity futures slightly positive on the S&P 500 through most of this morning. Talked a lot about a euro with a 101 handle on euro dollar. I am not used to where euro dollar is. We're back to 102. Yields look like this on a 10-year. They're climbing again by 3 or 4 basis points, 296.31. Here's another number maybe we've got to get used to, 99 on WTI, 99.33, up on a session by 0.8%. That's the price action. I believe we can get you a morning brief with Katie Lyons. Good morning, Kaylee.
Good morning from New York, John. There is a lot going on this morning in addition to those UK politics. Starting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern time, we get the account from the ECB's June meeting, essentially their equivalent of the minutes. How do they tee us up potentially for a 50 basis point hike in September? How are they thinking about fragmentation? All of this becoming more interesting because, as you pointed out, John, we have a euro hanging out around its weakest level since 2002. Then at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, it's the data point that Tom was talking about and Dean Mackey over at 0.72 was talking about yesterday. Pay attention to initial jobless claims. 230,000 is the number economists are expecting, but of course that tees us up for the payrolls report tomorrow. And finally, we heard from the Fed in the form of minutes yesterday, but as Tom alluded to, those are a couple weeks old. So we'll get updated thoughts from the Fed's Christopher Waller and Jim Bullard later on at 1 p.m. Eastern time. They're actually speaking at 2 separate events. Waller will be participating in a NABE interview. Jim Bullard is speaking in Little Rock, Arkansas. But what do they say about the potential for a 75 basis point hike this month? What in the data are they looking at in particular? We'll be paying attention to those remarks, John.
Kelly Lyons, thank you. TK, just looking at the bond market, just briefly, 2s10s, -6 basis points now.
For global Wall Street overnight, I would say greater curve inversion is interesting. And for the pros, each nuance here of curve inversion, each basis point matters. And the other thing that's given way ever so slightly, John, before we dive into to 10 Downing Street, the yen is slightly given way, weaker yen this morning.
Should we dive into 10 Downing Street?
Let's dive into I mean, we're looking for a statement noonish.
Something like that, according to Sky. Let's get the latest reporting for you. We can do that with Bloomberg's Anna Edwards at Abington Green and Lizzie Burden at number 10 Downing Street. And Lizzie, I want to come straight to you. The pressure building throughout the whole of yesterday. What's changed this morning?
Well, this morning there was a business as usual cabinet meeting that turned out to be not so, where the Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi, newly appointed, less than 48 hours in post, and his colleagues told the Prime Minister he needed to resign. And that seems to have been the turning point where Boris Johnson has decided that finally he's going to do the thing that we thought we didn't know when it could possibly come. He didn't seem a typical Boris Johnson thing to do, but now we're almost elbow to elbow in the press area on Downing Street. The crowds are gathering beyond the security gates at the end. There's no sign of a podium yet, but the speech is expected in the next couple of hours. There's also a report that Boris Johnson's been to see the Queen as a courtesy to tell her that he's planning to resign. And it's the culmination of the Westminster scandal, the Partygate crisis, and the cost of living crisis.
Anna Edwards, I was really taken aback by some of the comments by the people around Boris Johnson that it's over, maybe most likely Ben Wallace, who runs defense for the Prime Minister. Who is advising him now in these delicate moments before this statement? Who are the people in the room giving Boris Johnson counsel?
Well, a lot of people have been trying to give him counsel over recent days. John said that the pressure was building, and we saw those images yesterday of various members of his cabinet going to number 10 Downing Street to try and offer their wise words, to try and tell him that the game is up, the fight is over, but he wasn't listening. And some of the words I was struck by, the words of the Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi, as Lizzie says, just 48 hours in post, but he wrote his letter this morning saying that he publicly wants the Prime Minister to resign. He said he told him that in private yesterday, but the Prime Minister was not in the mood to listen to him. And that is someone he's been friends with for decades, somebody who he just recently promoted to that position of Chancellor, now coming out and saying the time was up. And so that really, as Lizzie says, was the final straw and one of the voices that maybe just cut through.
Anna Edwards, thank you, from Abington Green alongside Lizzie Burden on number 10 Downing Street. Team coverage continuing throughout this morning. Here from Washington, D.C. Tom, before we move on to D.C., can we just sit on what's been happening here? Just think about this. A newly minted Chancellor, and then he tweets this, 24 hours after he gets the new position under Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Just read this. Prime Minister, this is not sustainable, and it will only get worse for you, for the Conservative Party, and most importantly, for the whole of the country. You must do the right thing and go now. That's the Chancellor, right, Tom, of what, 24 hours ago?
And what's so important here is he speaks for a certain part of your Great Britain that is watching the follies of this, the foolishness of it. This is a guy who showed up, I don't remember where, Heathrow or on a boat, speaking no English in any number of years, was fluent, educated, started businesses from scratch, hugely successful. He's a self-made guy looking at a fancy guy who went to Oxford going down in chaos.
It will be super interesting as to whether he actually retains that post in a new government under a new Prime Minister.
Could he be Prime Minister?
I'm not sure about that. Let's see who's in the running, and we can catch up with the guys a little bit later. What I'm trying to understand, and what we were meant to get this morning, remember, is some kind of economic outlook from the Prime Minister and his new Chancellor. Of course, that's all changed. That's all changed. But will there be a shift, Tom, from Chancellor Sunak to Chancellor whoever it is under a new government?
Does this mean we get another season of The Crown? I think it says that.
How long do you have to wait for this season?
I don't know.
I'm not looking forward to that. That's the most American thing you've said this morning.
Thank you.
I'm not sure it gets more American than that.
It does.
From Washington, D.C. this morning, good morning to you all. With Tom Keane, I'm Jonathan Ferro, with futures up 0.2% on the S&P 500. A morning with full live coverage outside the White House. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Boris Johnson is calling it quits. The British Prime Minister agreed to resign after an unprecedented wave of resignations from his government. Johnson plans to stay on as caretaker leader until October, but some lawmakers in his Conservative Party are questioning whether he should. Last month, Federal Reserve officials solidified their resolve to keep raising rates to prevent higher inflation from being entrenched. According to minutes from the policymakers' meeting, officials viewed maintaining the central bank's credibility to control rising prices as crucial. They saw the return of 2% inflation as critical to achieving maximum employment. FBI Director Christopher Wray is escalating a dispute between the US and China over hacking. Wray warned Western companies that China aims to ransack their intellectual property so it can eventually dominate key industries. He told an event in London that Chinese spies are snooping on everything from Fortune 100 companies to startups. And the US and its allies are exploring ways to limit Russian oil revenues without hurting their own economies. Bloomberg's learned they've discussed trying to cap the price between $40 and $60 a barrel. They would do that by banning insurance and transportation services needed to ship Russian oil unless it is purchased below an agreed price. And Bloomberg's learned that British Airways is close to a deal with one of the unions representing check-in employees. That could avert further disruption after the airline had to scrap thousands of flights due to a staff shortage. The union had said that check-in staff at London's Heathrow Airport would walk out during the peak vacation period. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
This week, June jobs are in focus.
I think we're all very curious how June jobs came in.
The labor market is tremendously strong.
We have never been in a recession with declining unemployment.
This Friday, the surveillance team will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
There's so much uncertainty. We're going to have to monitor the data closely.
Everyone needs to recalibrate at 8:31 a.m. this Friday.
The June Jobs Report, Friday on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This recessionary fear is overtaking the market and convincing us that there's going to be something cataclysmic that's going to happen. And we think that that's not going to play out, and that those kind of, that portion of the pullback, you get that money back, and the stock market's going to rise between now and the end of the year.
Jonathan Golub there, the chief US equity strategist at Credit Suisse, live from Washington, D.C. this morning. Good morning to all. I'm Jonathan Ferro, together with Tom Keene. Jonathan Golub there, constructive on this equity market, looking for 4,300 year-end on the S&P 500. That forecast has come in, down from 49. Looking at equity futures right now, positive a little more than 0.1% on the S&P 500. A decent run of gains coming into Thursday. 3 straight days of gains on the S&P. We could make it 4. Yields just a little bit higher by a couple of basis points. 295, Tom, on a 10-year.
And a nuance here, John, is the big stocks are somewhat doing better than the NASDAQ. The Dow and the S&P actually giving me a better percentage change than you'd see in a normal market.
What do you make of the Golub optimism around earnings, Tom?
I think
to accept that we've got to slow down, but not to adjust your earnings outlook.
It's a recession bet, John, and this comes down to nominal GDP. Michael Darter was brilliant on this yesterday. You get the measurement of the real economy, doom and gloom out there right now, measurement of inflation, and how much of that inflation is productive for corporations.
Do you think we've had the recession trade, though? Do you think we actually have? No. When we look at the bond market, maybe you can make the case, I don't know. But when you look at the equity market and the earnings outlook, Tom, can you actually make the case that that's what we've seen?
No, I don't know. I think, again, we have to wait to get those first earnings. We'll see them from the banks, you know, setting us up for it. But as people have said, the guidance is absolutely critical, the forward guidance.
July 14th, JP Morgan,
is that
next week.
I did not know that. I mean, it's a fun.
July 13th, CPI too. Big week next week.
You're on top of it. Am I on vacation that week?
You are with us, I believe. Bramo's back too.
We'll see. Bram will be back from Halls. Right now, a very important conversation. Yes, we're continuing to follow the United Kingdom, but we must stay on this stock market. Anthony Dwyer is chief market strategist at Canaccord Genuity, and he's been absolutely brilliant about having the courage to be in the market. He writes of a summer rally. What kind of rally will it be, Tony Dwyer? And how do I have the courage to place new money in this time of fear?
Well, it's funny, Tom. As you know, this year, I've called it a tumultuous year, and I've been on the sidelines except for those nimble enough to dip their toe. And the issue is that you have a pretty severe restriction in money availability, not just from the Fed, but from the market, from home equity lines, all the things that kind of generate spending. So the macro backdrop really remains pretty tumultuous and not that great. That said, there's three conditions, Tom and John, that we look forward to at a bottom. And again, I think you have to differentiate a bottom versus the bottom. And that's an oversold enough condition. We've got that for sure. Enough pessimism. Number two, you need the idea that the Fed, people believe that the Fed may be discounted and near the end of their tightening. That's been evident with the drop in rates and commodities. And lastly, you got to have this belief that we could have a soft landing.
I look, Tony, at the soft landing and all the talk of economics. It's going to pivot off of Jobs Day. Does the statement of the labor economy mean anything to an equity strategist now, or are you already looking beyond tomorrow?
So I think you have to look beyond tomorrow because they're highly revised numbers. Now, guys, we've been doing this for multiple cycles. We're all old enough to have been through multiple cycles together. And typically, I'm the guy that's out there saying you want to buy the dip and money availability is good. But as you know, that's not been true. This year, we've stayed on the sidelines because when you look at real liquidity, which is readily available money versus what's being used for economic output, you had a historic rise coming out of the pandemic. I mean, every recession that we get comes from a unique reason, whether it's the S&L crisis, .com 9/11, great financial crisis, or pandemic, always a unique reason. The solution to the recession is always the same. Throw as much money at it as you can through lower interest rates. And the only thing, Tom, to answer your question directly that can allow us to look through the coming slowdown in economic activity and earnings, to me, is when the Fed signals a major change. Since I've been doing this since 1987, and I can't remember a major correction in the market where the bottom didn't come with a signaling change from the Fed.
Tony, you've got to work out what's going to stimulate that change. What will be the catalyst for that? What's the number? And I know that might sound a little juvenile. Maybe that doesn't come from the S&P 500. I know, Tony, typically you would look to credit. Credit spreads have been wider through the 2018 wides, and yet still this Federal Reserve will not pivot. So, Tony, where is that tipping point? Where is that pivot point for you?
Well, it'll come, John, I think with lower economic activity, which isn't necessarily tomorrow. The Fed has been very clear. After the May meeting, Kashkari said that they've withdrawn accommodation based on a mortgage rate movement. They've withdrawn accommodation faster than they gave it in 2020. Think about that statement in terms of the trillions of dollars. And then last week, Powell says that the risk of not having stable prices is greater than the risk of recession. Now, the idea that we're going to go back to a Volcker era where you invert the curve intentionally and shut down the economy to curtail inflation, during Volcker, you had a generational low in debt to GDP. Generational low. Today, we have a generational high. So I think that the risk that I think they've already likely gone too far, given what's taken place in housing and some interest-sensitive areas, and that to me is really going to be over the course of the rest of the year. We're going to find some pretty sharply slowing economic data.
Tony, awesome to catch up. Not the last piece of that, but awesome to catch up. Tony Dwyer there of Canaccord Genuity. Thank you, Tony. Tony's not alone, TK. I heard this from Peter Cheer of Academy as well. He said, look at the wealth destruction that's taking place right now. Look at what's happened in the market, equities, bonds, crypto. Look what's about to happen with housing, and think about what that's going to do to the consumer ultimately.
The real idea here from Tony Dwyer, who's had the courage to be in the market like Ben Laidler for years, is you've got to have a theory, you've got to have a setup, you've got to have a story. And his is fundamentally, this is a Fed that will blink. And I think that's the question for Jobs Day tomorrow. That's the question for all of our analysis up to JP Morgan earnings, is what are those items that changes the Fed? I'm not sure I know what they are.
Is that the question for that white building behind us? For the White House as well?
That's a political question. We're going to hear today from White House officials, folks, and they're going to, first thing out of their mouth is, look what we did about the gallon of gas. You know that's what we're going to hear.
It's started to come down just a little bit.
Petrol's come down in America, John.
Petrol, nice. Do you think that's a big enough difference for the people in this country right now?
For certain people in this country, speaking a simple political dialogue, read 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that's all that matters. We're looking at a much more complex dialogue. So is Boris Johnson.
Looking forward to catching up with members of this administration. We'll be doing that throughout this morning. We'll catch up with Heather Boushey. We'll also be catching up with Brian Deese, the director of the National Economic Council. All of that coming up this morning. Good morning from the nation's capital with Tom Keane. I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tests